In the winter of 1887, along a forgotten road in Colorado Territory, a woman stumbles through knee-deep snow with bare feet and a torn dress. Her name is Rosalie Finch, and everything she once called family has been stripped away by tragedy. She carries only a battered locket, and trauma so deep it has stolen her voice. When she collapses near the fence line of the Ashford Ranch, she's found by Colt, a wealthy cattleman who speaks little and trusts even less. Most men would have taken her to town, asked questions, demanded explanations, but Colt sees something in her broken silence that mirrors his own wounds from the war. Without a word, he carries her inside. Without questions, he gives her shelter. And in the months that follow, two damaged souls begin to heal through the quiet language of kindness and shared work. But what happens when the darkness that destroyed Rosalie's family finally tracks her down to this sanctuary of silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Ashford Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of Colorado Territory, like a kingdom carved from wilderness and willpower. When the morning sun crested the Rocky Mountains, it painted the snow-covered pastures in shades of gold that reminded a man why he'd chosen to build his life in such a place. The main house sat like a fortress against the elements, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with wide porches that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that caught every precious ray of winter light. Colt Ashford had built this empire with his own hands, starting with nothing but a war pension and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from surviving things that kill other men. At 38, he moved through his domain with the measured pace of someone who had learned that hasty decisions cost lives. His hair, dark as winter pine, showed threads of silver at the temples, not from age, but from carrying burdens that aged a man's soul faster than time. Every morning before dawn, he walked the same route through his house, down the main staircase, with its hand-carved banister, through the great room with its massive stone fireplace, past the dining room where he'd never entertained guests, and into the kitchen where Maria Gonzalez had coffee waiting. She'd been with him for 7 years, ever since he'd found her family stranded by a broken wagon wheel and offered them work and shelter. Her husband, Roberto, managed the bunkhouse and the dozen ranch hands who worked the cattle. Maria understood Colt's silence. She'd seen the medal he kept locked in his desk drawer, a bronze star that spoke of valor he'd never discuss. She'd watched him wake from nightmares that left him standing on the porch in his nightclothes, staring at horizons only he could see. When well-meaning neighbors asked why such a successful man remained unmarried, Maria would simply say that some wounds take longer to heal than others. The ranch operated with the precision of a military unit, because Colt ran it the only way. He knew how. Every fence post was straight, every gate properly latched, every animal accounted for. His Hereford cattle were the finest in 3 counties, and his horses were sought after from Denver to Santa Fe. Money wasn't something he worried about anymore. The war had taught him that security came from preparation, not wealth, though he'd managed to accumulate plenty of both. But this morning was different from all the others that had come before it. In the blue-grey hour before sunrise, Colt stood at his bedroom window, looking down at the guest room on the first floor where a woman lay sleeping. He'd carried her there 6 hours ago, her body so light in his arms that she seemed made of winter air and sorrow. The torn fabric of her dress had been fine once, silk and lace that spoke of prosperity and care. The bare feet he'd wrapped in, warm blankets, were soft, not hardened by years of walking rough ground. She'd stirred only once as he'd settled her under the quilts his mother had made decades ago. Her eyes had opened, wide and dark as mountain pools, and fixed on his face with an expression he recognized. It was the look of someone who had learned that the world could turn savage without warning, someone who had seen the worst of what people could do to each other. In that moment of recognition, something had passed between them, an understanding that required no words. Then her eyes had drifted to the battered silver locket clutched in her hand, and she'd closed them again, turning her face toward the wall. Colt had seen men die holding photographs of their wives and children. He'd held dying soldiers who whispered names of people they'd never see again. That locket, whatever it contained, was this woman's anchor to something she'd lost. The desperate way she'd clung to it told him everything he needed to know about why she'd been walking barefoot through a Colorado winter. From his bedroom window, he could see the path of disturbed snow where he'd found her, a wandering line that disappeared into the darkness beyond his property. Whatever had brought her to his fence line, she'd been traveling for some time. Her exhaustion hadn't been the tiredness of a single day's journey, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been running until she had nothing left. As the sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered pastures in brilliant white, Colt made his decision. He would ask no questions. He would demand no explanations. Whatever had brought this woman to his land, whatever she was fleeing from, he would offer what he could: shelter, safety, and the respect of silence. It was the same gift he'd wished for when he'd returned from the war, a place where no one demanded to know about the things that woke him in the night, where his past could rest undisturbed while he built something new from the ashes of who he used to be. Below, Maria's voice drifted up from the kitchen, speaking soft Spanish words to Roberto as they prepared for another day. Soon the ranch hands would emerge from the bunkhouse for breakfast, and the familiar rhythm of ranch life would begin. But everything had changed with the arrival of the woman sleeping in his guest room, though none of them knew it yet. Colt, dressed in the same clothes he wore every day, wool pants, flannel shirt, leather boots worn soft with age and care. But as he reached for the door handle, he found himself moving more quietly than usual, conscious of the sleeping woman below. For the first time in years, the silence of his house felt different. It no longer seemed empty. It felt full of possibility. Rosalie Finch awakened to the sound of voices speaking in gentle Spanish, the words flowing like water over stones. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, only that the bed beneath her was soft and warm, so different from the hard ground and bitter cold that had been her world for endless days. Then memory returned. The snow, the fence, the man with kind eyes who had carried her to safety without asking her name. She lay still, listening to the rhythm of the household awakening around her. Footsteps crossed overhead, measured and careful. A door opened and closed. Water ran in pipes somewhere behind the walls. These were the sounds of a home where people moved with purpose and consideration for others, so different from the chaos and violence that had shattered her own world. The guest room where she found herself was simple but comfortable, furnished with pieces that spoke of careful craftsmanship rather than expensive taste. A handmade quilt covered her, its pattern of interlocking rings, worked in shades of blue and cream. The walls held no pictures, but the single window looked out onto a world transformed by snow into something clean and peaceful. Her torn dress had been draped over a chair beside the bed, and she clutched the silver locket that had never left her grasp. Even in unconsciousness, her fingers had remained wrapped around the only thing she had left of her former life. Inside the locket, pressed behind cracked glass, was a photograph so precious that losing it would be like losing her soul all over. Again, a soft knock at the door made her heart race with sudden panic. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, her voice trapped somewhere deep in her throat, where words had retreated, after witnessing things that should never be spoken aloud. "Senora." The voice was female, older, kind. "I have brought you some things." The door opened slowly, and a woman in her 50s entered, carrying a bundle of clothes and a steaming cup. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes held the warm authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. She moved with the unhurried grace of a person who understood that frightened creatures needed patience above all else. "I am Maria," she said, setting the cup on the bedside table. The scent of chamomile tea filled the room. "I help Senor Colt with the house. These clothes, they belong to his sister. She was about your size, I think." Rosalie's eyes went to the bundle, a simple grey wool dress, clean undergarments, warm stockings, and a pair of leather boots that looked barely worn. The generosity of strangers had become foreign to her. For so long, every face had meant danger, every approach a potential threat. Maria seemed to understand her silence. She didn't push for conversation or explanations. Instead, she moved to the washstand and poured water from a blue ceramic pitcher into the matching bowl. Steam rose from its surface. "When you are ready," Maria said, "there is food in the kitchen. Senor Colt, he has gone to check the cattle, but he said you should eat when you wake. He said you should rest as long as you need." The kindness in her voice nearly broke something inside Rosalie that had been holding together through sheer will. She tried to speak, to offer thanks, but her throat remained closed, the words locked away with everything else she couldn't bear. To remember, Maria studied her with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize deep grief. "You do not need to talk, mijita. Sometimes silence is the wisest choice. Senor Colt, he understands this too." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The bathroom is across the hall. Hot water comes from the tap. Senor Colt, he installed. Pipes from the well. Take your time. No one will hurry you here." After Maria left, Rosalie sat on the edge of the bed, holding the clean clothes against her chest. The simple grey dress was made of good wool, mended in places with tiny, careful stitches. The boots were soft leather, broken in by someone who had walked gently through the world. These had belonged to a sister, someone who had been loved and cared for. She rose slowly, her body still weak from cold and exhaustion, and made her way to the washstand. The warm water felt like a luxury beyond measure as she cleaned away the dirt and desperation of her long journey. In the small mirror above the washstand, she saw a stranger, a thin woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that held too much knowledge of cruelty. Her dark hair hung lank and lifeless around her shoulders, but as she washed and dressed in the borrowed clothes, something began to shift inside her. The dress fit well, the boots were comfortable, and for the first time in months she felt human again, rather than like a hunted animal. The torn silk dress lay where Maria had left it, a reminder of the life that had been destroyed. Once, she had worn such dresses to dinner parties and church socials, had danced in them at barn raisings and wedding celebrations. That woman felt like someone from a dream now, someone who had believed the world was fundamentally good, and that terrible. Things happened to other people. She folded the ruined dress carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of the dresser, not ready to throw it away, but ready to put it aside. Then she sat in the chair by the window, the silver locket warm in her palm, and watched the sun climb higher over a landscape that seemed to promise peace. From the kitchen came the sounds of breakfast, the sizzle of bacon in a pan, the clink of dishes, Roberto's deep voice thanking Maria for coffee. Normal sounds of a household beginning its day. She had forgotten such sounds existed, had lived so long with only fear and silence and the constant need to keep moving. When the breakfast sounds quieted and she heard the back door close as Roberto went to his work, Rosalie finally found the courage to leave the guest room. The hallway was wide and bright, lined with windows that let in the morning light. Family photographs hung on the walls, images of people with the same strong jaw and steady eyes as the man who had saved her. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, with a large table surrounded by mismatched chairs and a cook stove that radiated comfortable heat. Maria looked up from washing dishes and smiled. "Buenos dias, mijita. Come, sit. I have kept your breakfast warm." Rosalie took a seat at the table, and Maria placed before her a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, along with a jar of honey and butter, still soft from churning. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, each bite a reminder of how long it had been since she'd eaten a proper meal. Maria didn't try to make conversation. She simply refilled Rosalie's teacup when it emptied and occasionally hummed softly as she worked. The companionable silence felt like a gift. No pressure to explain herself, no questions about where she'd come from or why she couldn't speak. When footsteps sounded on the front porch, Rosalie tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the locket, at her throat. But Maria's calm expression didn't change. "That is only Senor Colt," she said gently. "He comes for coffee before riding out to the far pastures." The door opened, and he entered, bringing with him the scent of cold air and horses. He was taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered in his worn coat, his dark hair touched with frost. When he saw her sitting at the table, he stopped, removing his hat with unconscious courtesy. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and again. She felt that strange recognition. Two people who had learned that words could be weapons, that silence could be sanctuary. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that asked nothing and promised everything. "Ma'am," he said simply, then turned to Maria. "Coffee, if you please." And in that moment, Rosalie understood that she had found something she'd thought was lost forever, a place where she could begin to heal. 3 days passed in the gentle rhythm of the Ashford ranch, and Rosalie began to understand the careful choreography of a well-run household. She watched from the kitchen window as Colt emerged each morning before dawn, his breath visible in the cold air as he walked to the barn. She learned that he checked every animal personally, that he knew each horse by name and temperament, that his hands were gentle with creatures that depended on him for care. The hand-carved wooden cross she'd carried in her dress pocket now sat on the windowsill of her room, catching the morning light. It had been her father's, whittled by his own hands during the long evenings when he'd told her stories of his childhood in Ohio. Faith had been as natural to her family as breathing, until the day when prayer seemed powerless against human evil. Now the cross stood as a question mark rather than an exclamation point, not abandoned, but waiting for her to decide what it might mean in this new life. Maria had shown her the rhythms of the house with patient kindness, how Colt preferred his coffee black and strong, how he liked his eggs over easy but would never complain if they came out differently, how he always hung his hat on the same peg by the door and placed his boots in the exact same spot each evening. These small rituals, Maria explained with gentle humor, were how some men made sense of a world that had once seemed senseless. "He is a good man," Maria told her as they folded laundry together, "but he carries heavy things like you do. Sometimes heavy things make people quiet, but that does not mean their hearts are not speaking." Rosalie found herself drawn to small tasks around the house. Without being asked, she began setting the table for meals, sweeping the front porch, tending the fire in the great room. Her hands remembered domestic skills that had once been second nature: how to fold a fitted sheet, how to arrange flowers in a simple vase, how to mend a torn seam so it was stronger than before. Colt noticed everything, but said nothing. She would catch him watching her from the doorway as she worked, his expression thoughtful but undemanding. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and he would nod slightly, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition of her need to contribute, to be useful rather than simply sheltered. On the 4th morning, she found the courage to venture outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the world lay pristine under a blanket of white that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Her breath formed clouds in the crisp air as she walked carefully across the yard, Maria's borrowed boots crunching softly in the snow. The barn was warm and dim, filled with the gentle sounds of horses moving in their stalls, and the sweet scent of hay. She stood in the doorway watching Colt brush a magnificent black stallion. His movements were rhythmic and soothing, and the horse stood perfectly still under his care, eyes half closed in contentment. He sensed her presence and turned, brush still in hand. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the width of the barn. Then he gestured to a smaller horse in the next stall, a gentle-eyed mare, the color of autumn leaves. "This is Ginger," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the peaceful space. "She's getting on in years, but she's got a good heart." It was the longest sentence she'd heard him speak, and she understood it was an invitation. Nudging slowly, she approached the stall. The mare stretched her neck over the gate, velvet nostrils investigating this new person with curious interest. Rosalie reached up tentatively, her fingers stroking the soft muzzle. The simple contact, warm, living, innocent, brought tears to her eyes. She'd forgotten what it felt like to touch something that meant no harm, to stand close to a creature that wanted nothing from her but gentle attention. Colt watched her for a moment, then quietly moved to continue his work with the stallion. No questions, no conversation, just acceptance of her presence in his world. The silence between them felt natural now, comfortable rather than strained. She spent an hour in the barn that morning, reacquainting herself with the simple pleasure of being near animals that knew nothing of human cruelty. When she finally returned to the house, she found Maria preparing lunch and wordlessly joined in, setting the table and slicing bread with movements that felt less tentative than they had the day before. That evening, as she sat by the fire in the great room, she noticed Colt reading at his desk in the corner. A leather-bound ledger lay open before him, but his attention had drifted to the flames dancing in the fireplace. She studied his profile, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into prairie sun and winter wind, the way his shoulders carried themselves as if always ready for responsibility. She wondered what battles he'd fought, what memories kept him awake at night. Maria had mentioned the war, but Rosalie knew there were different kinds of wars. Some fought on distant battlefields, others waged in the quiet spaces of a man's own heart. When he rose to bank the fire for the night, she stood as well, uncertain of the protocol in this house, where she was neither family nor servant, but something in between. He paused, poker in hand, and looked at her with those steady grey eyes. "Sleep well," he said simply, and she heard in those two words a promise that her rest would be undisturbed, that this house would stand guard over her dreams. She managed a small nod in response, her first real communication since her arrival. It wasn't much, but it was something, a tiny bridge built between two islands of silence. In her room that night, she sat on the edge of the bed, holding the wooden cross, turning it over in her fingers. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the glass like prayers made visible. For the first time since her world had shattered, she felt something that might eventually become peace. The locket lay on the nightstand. Beside her, its weight both comfort and burden. Inside, behind the cracked glass, her family smiled at her from a photograph taken on a day when they'd believed in happy endings. Someday, perhaps, she would be ready to share their story, but not yet. For now, it was enough to know that in this house, her silence was respected, her grief was witnessed without judgment, and her healing could happen at its own pace. Tomorrow would bring new, small steps forward. Tonight, she would sleep without fear for the first time in months, wrapped in quilts made by the mother of the man who had saved her life by asking nothing of her but the gift of her presence. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard the house settling around her, the soft pop of cooling timbers, the whisper of wind around the eaves, the distant sound of Colt's boots on the stairs as he made his way to his own rest. These were the sounds of home, of safety, of a place where broken things could slowly become whole again. The wooden cross caught a beam of moonlight from the window, and for the first time since she'd lost everything, Rosalie thought she might one day find her way back to believing in something larger than loss. The peace of the Ashford ranch shattered on a Tuesday morning when 3 riders appeared at the main gate like harbingers of a past that refused to stay buried. Rosalie was in the kitchen with Maria, learning to knead dough for the evening's bread, when Roberto burst through the back door with urgency written across his weathered face. "Senor Colt," he called toward the barn, his voice carrying the sharp edge of warning. Strangers coming up the road, they looked like trouble. Through the kitchen window, Rosalie could see them approaching. 3 men on horseback, their long coats dark against the pristine snow. Even at a distance, something about their bearing made her blood turn to ice water. They rode with the predatory confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, their eyes scanning the ranch buildings with calculated interest. Maria's hands stilled on her rolling pin as she followed Rosalie's gaze. "Mijita," she said quietly, "perhaps you should go to your room, close the door." But Rosalie found herself frozen at the window, watching as Colt emerged from the barn to meet the approaching riders. His posture had changed. Shoulders squared, stance wider, every line of his body speaking the language of a man prepared for conflict. This was the soldier Maria had hinted at, the warrior hidden beneath the quiet rancher's exterior, the lead. Ryder was a lean man, with a scraggly beard and eyes like chips of flint. He wore a badge on his coat that caught the morning sunlight, but there was something about the way he wore it that suggested authority without legitimacy. When he spoke, his voice carried across the yard with the harsh confidence of a man who believed might made right. "Morning, friend," he called to Colt, though there was nothing friendly in his tone. "Name's Marshal Tucker. We're looking for a woman who might have passed through these parts. Dangerous fugitive. Goes by the name of Rose Finch." Rosalie's heart stopped. Rose, the name her husband had called her in tender moments. The name that had died with him on that terrible day when their peaceful world had exploded into violence and flame. Hearing it spoken by this man's lips felt like desecration. "Can't say I've seen any strangers," Colt replied, his voice level and unrevealing. "What's this woman supposed to have done?" The second rider, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes, pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Even from the kitchen window, Rosalie could see it was a wanted poster, the ink still fresh enough to suggest recent printing. The crude sketch bore enough resemblance to her face to make her knees weak. "Murder," Tucker said with satisfaction. "Killed her husband and child in cold blood, then burned down their house to cover the evidence. Been tracking her for weeks. Trail's gone cold, but we know she came through this territory." The lie was so monstrous, so perfectly inverted from the truth, that Rosalie had to grip the windowsill to keep from falling. Behind her, Maria's sharp intake of breath told her that the older woman understood exactly who these men were hunting. Colt studied the poster for a long moment, his expression giving nothing away. When he handed it back, his movements were deliberate and controlled. "Like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description. You boys might try the settlements further south. Lot of traffic through those parts this time of year." The third rider, younger than the others but with the same predatory gleam in his eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "You sure about that?" "Mister, we heard tell there's been smoke from your chimney day and night lately. Might be you're harboring someone and don't even know they're wanted." It was a fishing expedition, Rosalie realized. They weren't certain she was here, but they suspected. Someone, somewhere, had seen her or heard something that led them to this area. The thought of bringing danger to Colt and his people made her stomach clench with familiar guilt. "Smoke from the chimney in winter," Colt said, with just a touch of dry humor. "Well, that's surely suspicious. Next thing you know, you'll be investigating folks for having lanterns after dark." Tucker's eyes narrowed. "We'd like to take a look around your property if you don't mind, just to be thorough." "I do mind," Colt said, and now there was steel in his voice that made even these hard men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "This is private property, and you've got no warrant that I can see. If you want to search my land, you'll need to come back with proper legal authority." "Now listen here," the heavy-set man began, but Tucker held up a hand to silence him. "Of course, we understand your position," Tucker said with false reasonableness. "Property rights and all that, but you should know that harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. If we find out you've been sheltering this woman—" He let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "I appreciate the warning," Colt replied, unmoved. "Now, unless you have other business here, I've got cattle to tend." The three men exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by his calm resistance to their intimidation. Tucker folded the wanted poster and tucked it back into his coat. "We'll be staying in town for a few days," he said. "Asking questions, checking with the neighbors. If you remember seeing anything or anyone, that might be helpful. We'd appreciate you letting us know." "I'll be sure to do that," Colt said, though his tone suggested the opposite. As the riders turned their horses toward the gate, Tucker called back over his shoulder, "That's a fine spread you got here, Ashford. Be a shame if anything happened to it." The threat was naked now, stripped of any pretense of lawful authority. Colt watched them ride away until they disappeared beyond the rise, then turned toward the house with grim purpose. Rosalie found herself backing away from the window, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The walls of the warm kitchen seemed to be closing in around her, and the familiar taste of fear filled her mouth like copper pennies. Maria was beside her instantly, strong, hands guiding her to a chair. "Breathe, Mijita, slow and deep. You are safe here." But safety was an illusion, Rosalie knew. She had brought death to this peaceful place, just as she had brought it to her own family. The men who had murdered her husband and daughter, who had burned their home and fabricated evidence to make her the criminal. They had found her again. And now Colt and everyone who sheltered her would pay the price for her presence. When Colt entered the kitchen, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, she tried to stand, tried to find words to tell him she would leave immediately, but her voice remained locked away, and her legs would not support her weight. He knelt beside her chair, his grey eyes holding hers with steady compassion. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I want you to know that nothing those men said changes anything. You're welcome here for as long as you want to stay. But I think it's time we had ourselves a conversation about what we're really dealing with." Behind the cracked glass of her locket, her family's faces seemed to plead with her to trust this man who had already risked so much on her behalf. The wooden cross on her windowsill caught the light like a reminder that sometimes, in the darkest moments, grace appeared in unexpected forms. Rosalie looked into Colt's eyes and saw the same steady resolve that had carried him through war and built a ranch from wilderness. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt the fragile stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone strong enough to stand against the darkness that pursued her. The wanted poster in Tucker's pocket was a lie, but the danger it represented was terrifyingly real. The sanctuary of silence was over. Now came the time for truth, no matter how painful the telling might be. The silence in the kitchen stretched like a held breath, until Rosalie's trembling fingers found the silver locket at her throat. With movements that spoke of long-practiced care, she opened the delicate clasp and revealed what lay hidden behind the cracked glass. A photograph burned at the edges, as if salvaged from flame. Colt moved closer, his eyes taking in the image of a young woman in a white dress, standing beside a tall man in his Sunday best. Between them, a little girl with dark ringlets smiled at the camera with the innocent joy of a child who believed the world was safe and good. The resemblance between the woman in the photograph and the one sitting before him was unmistakable, though grief had carved new lines in her face and stolen the light from her eyes. "My husband, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible, after so many weeks of silence. "And our daughter Sarah, she was 6. The words came haltingly, as if each one had to be pulled from some deep well of pain. Maria crossed herself silently, understanding flooding her weathered face as the pieces of Rosalie's story began to fit together. "The men who were just here," Rosalie continued, her fingers tracing the burned edges of the photograph. "They're the ones who killed them, who burned our house, who made me watch." Colt's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "Can you tell me what happened?" She closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, it was as if she was seeing it all. "Happened once more. Thomas owned a sawmill outside of Pueblo, good land near the river. We'd been there 5 years, built everything from nothing. Sarah was starting to read, learning her letters from the Bible my mother gave me. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she pressed on, as if the words had been waiting too long to be spoken. 3 men came to the mill in October, said they represented investors from Denver who wanted to buy Thomas out. He told them the land wasn't for sale. It was our home, our future. They said they'd be back with a better offer. She opened her eyes, meeting Colt's steady gaze. They came back, all right. 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, Maria moved quietly to the stove, pouring tea with hands that shook slightly. She'd seen enough of the world to know where this story was heading, and her heart ached for the young woman who had to live with such memories. They broke down our door, Rosalie whispered. Thomas tried to protect us, but there were 3 of them, and they had guns. They made me watch while they... Her voice broke entirely. Colt leaned forward, his presence steady and grounding. You don't have to tell me everything, not now. But she shook her head, finding strength from somewhere deep inside. You need to know what you're risking by keeping me here. After they killed Thomas and Sarah, they set fire to the house. But they wanted it to look like I had done it, like I had murdered my own family and tried to burn the evidence. The badge that man was wearing, Colt said quietly. Tucker, he called himself. Was he one of them? The leader, she confirmed, her hand moving instinctively to her throat where bruises had long since faded. He's the one who strangled me, left me for dead in the flames. I only survived because part of the roof collapsed, and I fell through, into the root cellar. The fire burned over me, but it didn't reach where I landed. The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of the tea kettle and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Colt studied the photograph again, seeing now not just a family portrait, but evidence of lives cut short by greed and violence. How long were you in that cellar, he asked. 2 days. When I finally crawled out, the house was ash and the mill was gone. There were men in town asking questions about the fire, about the poor woman who had lost her mind and killed her family before, burning them all. Tucker and his men had been busy spreading their story. She lifted the locket, showing him a hidden compartment behind the photograph that she opened with a fingernail. Inside, folded tiny, was a piece of paper that looked official, even in its miniature state. Land deed, she explained. My father's name is on it, then Thomas's. It's all that's left to prove what really happened, what they really wanted. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if sharing the burden was giving her back some of her power. They needed me dead to file their claim, but they needed it to look legal. A murderer who died in her own fire would be perfect. No heirs. To contest the deed. Colt took the deed carefully, his eyes scanning the careful script that detailed ownership of prime timberland along the Arkansas River. He understood now why these men had been so thorough in their deception, why they'd gone to the trouble of creating a wanted poster and playing the role of lawmen. You've been running ever since, he said. It wasn't a question. 3 months, she confirmed. Walking mostly, sleeping rough. I couldn't trust anyone in Pueblo. Tucker had everyone convinced I was a killer. I just kept moving north, thinking maybe I could find someone who would listen, someone who could help me prove the truth. Why didn't you go to the territorial authorities, real law enforcement? A bitter smile crossed her face. With what proof? My word against 3 men with badges and a story that made me look guilty. I'm a woman with no family, no connections, no money. They had papers that showed I was a murderer. Who would believe me? Colt folded the deed carefully and handed it back to her. In his years of fighting, both in war and in building his ranch, he'd learned to recognize truth when he heard it. Everything about her story rang with the authenticity of lived trauma. The small details, the way her body tensed when she spoke of violence, the careful way she held the locket as if it contained her very soul. They'll be back, he said finally. Men like that don't give up when there's money involved. I know. Her voice was barely a whisper. I should leave. Tonight. I've brought enough danger to your home already. No. The word came out harder than he'd intended, and he softened his tone. No, you shouldn't leave. Running hasn't solved anything so far, has it? These men found you here. They'll find you anywhere you go. Maria set the teacup gently beside Rosalie's elbow, her hand briefly touching the younger woman's shoulder in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "Senor Colt is right," she said firmly. "Running only makes you tired. Sometimes a person must turn and face the wolf." Rosalie looked between them, seeing something in their faces that she'd almost forgotten existed. The willingness of good people to stand against injustice, even when it wasn't their fight. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "These men are killers. They won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. If you help me, if you stand against them, they'll destroy everything you've built here." Colt stood, moving to the window to look out at the ranch he'd carved from wilderness with his own hands. The barn where he'd taught her to gentle horses. The pastures where his cattle grazed. The bunkhouse where men who'd become family slept in peace. All of it could be lost if he made the wrong choice. But when he turned back to face her, his expression was resolute. "Mom," he said quietly, "I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while evil ones take what they want. I've seen towns burned and families destroyed because folks minded their own business instead of standing together." He moved closer, his grey eyes holding hers with steady conviction. "I didn't pull you out of that snow just to hand you over to the men who put you there." In that moment, looking at his face, Rosalie finally understood what Maria had been trying to tell her. About this quiet man, he wasn't just offering shelter, he was offering to fight. And for the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt something stronger than despair stirring in her chest. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone who had lost everything. But as she sat in the warm kitchen, surrounded by people who had chosen to believe her story and stand with her, she felt its first tentative flames beginning to kindle in her heart. The leather-bound journal lay open on Colt's desk, its pages yellowed with age and filled with his father's careful handwriting. Samuel Ashford had started the ranch with nothing but determination and a belief that a man's worth was measured not by what he accumulated, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for others. On the page before Colt, written in fading ink, were words that seemed meant for this moment. "A ranch is more than land and cattle. It's a promise to stand as sanctuary for those who need it most." 3 days had passed since Rosalie's revelation, and the atmosphere around the ranch had shifted. From peaceful routine to quiet preparation, Colt moved through his daily tasks with the measured efficiency of a man making ready for battle, while Rosalie threw herself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to earn her place in a world that had rejected her. She had insisted on taking over more of the household duties, despite Maria's gentle protests that she was a guest, not a servant. But Rosalie understood what Maria perhaps did not, that in this house contribution was a form of belonging, and she needed to belong somewhere before the wolves returned to tear it all down. "Show me how to preserve the meat," she asked Maria, as they worked together in the kitchen, "and how to store grain so it won't spoil, how to make soap from lye and fat." These were skills her mother had taught her long ago, before marriage and prosperity had made such knowledge seem unnecessary. But now, watching Maria's practiced hands demonstrate the old ways, Rosalie felt herself reconnecting with a heritage of women who had known how to make something from nothing, how to stretch resources through hard times. Colt found them in the kitchen that afternoon, the wooden table covered with strips of beef hanging on improvised racks, the air thick with the smell of salt and smoke. Rosalie looked up from her work, a streak of salt across her cheek and determination in her dark eyes. "We need to be ready," she said simply. "If those men come back, if they bring others, this place needs to be able to stand on its own for a while." He nodded, understanding that she was thinking like a general's wife, planning for siege rather than surrender. It was a practical approach that matched his own military mind, and he found himself respecting not just her resilience, but her strategic thinking. "Roberto's been talking to the men," he told her. "They know the situation. None of them are running." This surprised her. She'd expected the ranch hands to distance themselves from trouble that wasn't theirs to claim. But Roberto had gathered them in the bunkhouse that first evening and explained the situation in his mixture of Spanish and English that somehow made everything clear. Senora Rosalie, he'd told them. She is family now. Family doesn't run when wolves come hunting. The men, weathered cowboys who'd spent their lives moving from ranch to ranch, following work and wages, had listened with the gravity of soldiers receiving orders. Then, one by one, they'd nodded their agreement, not because Colt paid their wages, but because the code of the West demanded that good men stand together against evil ones. Now, as Rosalie worked beside Maria to prepare for an uncertain future, she could see those men through the kitchen window, going about their tasks with new purpose. They checked the fences more carefully, kept their rifles closer at hand, and rode in pairs when checking the far pastures. "They're good men," Colt said, following her gaze. "Most of them have seen trouble before. A few fought in the war, like me. They know what it means to hold a line." That evening, as the household gathered for supper, Colt spread a hand-drawn map of the ranch across the dining room table. It showed every building, every fence line, every approach that riders might take. His father's journal lay beside it, open to pages that detailed the defensive preparations Samuel Ashford had made during the Indian troubles of the 1860s. "The house sits on the highest ground," Colt explained, pointing to the careful markings. On the map, good sight lines in all directions, solid stone foundation, thick walls. "The barn's built the same way. My father believed in making things that would last through whatever came." Rosalie studied the map with the focused attention of someone whose life might depend on understanding every detail. She traced the routes between buildings, noting which areas offered cover and which left a person exposed. "Water," she asked. "Wells here behind the house, spring-fed, never runs dry. There's a hand pump in the kitchen and another in the barn." He pointed to marks on the map that showed the water system his father had designed. "Pipes run underground, harder for someone to cut off our supply. Food storage, root cellar under. The kitchen, smokehouse behind the barn, grain bins in the loft, enough to last months if we're careful." He looked up from the map to meet her eyes. "My father built this place to weather storms, whatever kind they might be." Roberto leaned over the table, his finger tracing the fence lines. "The men, they know every inch of this land. We can set up watch posts here and here." He pointed to strategic positions that would give early warning of approaching riders. "And if trouble comes, we have places ready for the horses, ways to move without being seen." As they planned through the evening, Rosalie felt something she hadn't experienced since before her world collapsed. The sense of being part of something larger than herself, of belonging to a group that would fight for each other. These people had accepted her story without question, had chosen to risk their safety for a woman they'd known less than a week. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging from thoughts she'd been carrying silently. "Why are you all willing to do this? You barely know me." The room fell quiet, and she wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary, asked something too direct for the careful courtesy that governed their interactions. It was Maria who answered first, her voice gentle but firm. "Because this is what good people do, mijita. We stand together against the darkness." Roberto nodded his agreement. "In Mexico, my family, we had troubles like this. Bad men who wanted our land, who would kill to take it. We learned that alone. We are nothing. Together we are strong." Colt closed his father's journal, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. "My pa used to say that a man's character isn't measured by what he does when it's easy, but by what he does when it's hard. You came to us broken and hunted, and we gave you shelter. Now those who broke you want to finish the job." He looked directly at her, his gray eyes holding steady conviction. "That makes it our fight, too." Later that night, as Rosalie sat by, her bedroom window looking out at the star-filled sky, she thought about the strange turns that had brought her to this place. 3 months ago, she'd been a mill owner's wife with a secure future and a child to raise. Now she was a fugitive, dependent on the kindness of strangers who were preparing to risk everything for her. The wooden cross on her windowsill caught. The moonlight, and for the first time since that terrible night, she found herself able to pray, not for rescue or revenge, but for the strength to be worthy of the faith these people had placed in her. They were preparing to fight her battle, but she would not let them fight it alone. Tomorrow would bring new preparations, new plans, new ways to turn a peaceful ranch into a fortress. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet sounds of people she was learning to call family, Rosalie felt something that had been missing from her life since the fire. The knowledge that she was not facing the darkness alone. The journal entry her eyes fell upon as Colt had closed. The book seemed to echo in her mind. True strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing when to accept the hands that reach out to help us stand. Her father had carved that wooden cross during evenings, when he'd spoken of faith and community, of the way good people were called to lift each other up. Now in this ranch house surrounded by mountains and defended by people who barely knew her, Rosalie began to understand what he'd been trying to teach her all those years ago. The sewing kit had belonged to Colt's mother, its wooden box worn, smooth by generations of careful hands. Inside, spools of thread nestled beside silver thimbles, bone buttons weighted in small compartments, and needles of every size lay arranged in precise rows. When Maria presented it to Rosalie with gentle ceremony, she understood she was being offered more than tools. She was being given a place in the long line of women who had tended this household. Senora Ashford, she was very skilled, Maria explained, as they sat together in the morning light that streamed through the kitchen window. She could make a dress from feed sacks that looked finer than anything from the store in town, and her quilts, they were like prayers stitched in cloth. Rosalie ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the box, feeling the slight depressions, worn by other hands, other years of patient work. Since arriving at the ranch, she'd mended torn shirts and darned socks with makeshift supplies, but having proper tools felt like being welcomed into a sacred tradition. There are things in the attic, Maria continued, fabric pieces, patterns, quilts that need finishing. Senor Colt, he could never bear to move them, but perhaps now the unspoken suggestion hung between them like an invitation to step fully into this life, to claim not just shelter, but belonging. Rosalie nodded slowly, understanding that accepting this gift meant accepting the role of woman of the house, with all the responsibilities and privileges that entailed. That afternoon, she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the sewing kit tucked under her arm like a treasure. The space under the eaves was filled with carefully stored memories, trunks of clothes, boxes of books, furniture draped in sheets like sleeping ghosts. But what drew her attention was the quilting frame set up near the single window, where natural light would be best for close work. Stretched in the frame was a partially completed quilt in shades of blue and white, its pattern intricate and beautiful. A basket beside the frame held cut pieces ready for assembly, and a folder contained careful drawings showing how the design was meant to progress. Someone had been in the middle of creating something magnificent when death or departure had interrupted the work. Rosalie studied the stitches already in place, admiring the tiny, even work that spoke of years of practice and infinite patience. She could almost see the woman who had worked here, Colt's mother perhaps, or his sister, sitting in the chair that waited beside the frame, her needle catching the light as she built beauty one stitch at a time. As the days passed, she fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Mornings were spent in the kitchen with Maria, learning the particular preferences of the household and perfecting skills that had grown rusty during her months of running. Afternoons found her in the attic, working on the abandoned quilt while snow whispered against the window and the house settled around her with comfortable sighs. The repetitive motion of sewing had a healing quality she hadn't expected. As her needle moved in and out of the fabric, following patterns laid down by other hands, she found her mind quieting. The constant vigilance that had kept her alive during her months of flight began to ease, replaced by the meditative peace of useful work. Colt found her there one evening as the sun was setting, the attic filled with golden light that made the blue and white fabric glow like captured sky. She looked up from her work to find him standing at the top of the stairs, his expression thoughtful as he took in the scene. "My mother started that quilt the year I was born," he said quietly, moving closer to examine her progress. "She worked on it every winter for 20 years, adding pieces as our family grew, recording our history in cloth." Rosalie's needle stilled in her hand. "I can stop if you'd rather. I didn't realize—" "No," he said quickly, then softened his tone. "Please, don't stop. It's been waiting up here for 15 years, hoping for hands that could finish what she started." He touched the edge of the fabric gently, his fingers tracing patterns his mother had stitched when he was a child. "She always said a quilt wasn't meant to sit unfinished, said they only had meaning when they were keeping someone warm." As winter deepened around the ranch, their daily routines took on new significance. What had begun as necessity, preparing for potential siege, evolved into something richer. The household was becoming a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by the decision to stand together against whatever might come. Rosalie found herself learning not just the practical skills of running a ranch household, but the subtler arts of reading the rhythms of people who had learned to work as one. She discovered that Roberto sang softly in Spanish when he was content, that Maria hummed old lullabies when she was worried, that Colt grew very still and quiet when he was thinking through problems. In the evenings, after the dishes were cleared and the livestock tended, they would gather in the great room, where the fire painted dancing shadows on the walls. Sometimes Roberto would bring his guitar and play melodies that spoke of distant places and eternal longings. Sometimes Maria would tell stories of her childhood in New Mexico, tales full of wise women and brave men, and the magic that lived in ordinary moments. And sometimes Colt would read aloud from books that had belonged to his family, poetry and philosophy, adventure stories and works of history that spoke of other times when good people had faced impossible choices and found the courage to do what was right. During these quiet hours, Rosalie would work on the quilt, her needle moving steadily as she listened to voices that had become dear to her. The pattern was beginning to reveal itself, a design called wedding ring, with interlocking circles that represented the unbreakable bonds between people who chose to love each other despite the world's attempts to tear them apart. One night, as she worked by lamplight while Colt read from a volume of Emerson, she realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The constant fear that had driven her through months of running had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something stronger. The fierce determination to protect this place and these people who had given her more than shelter. They had given her back her life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Colt read in his deep, quiet voice, said that the only way to have a friend is to be one. I think he might have extended that to family. The only way to have a family is to choose to be family to others. Maria looked up from her mending, smiling at the words. "See, this is true. Family is not only the people who share your blood, but the people who share your heart." Rosalie's needle caught the lamplight as she added another tiny stitch to the growing pattern. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees with the sound of distant prayers, and snow continued its ancient work of covering the world in peace. Inside, three people who had found each other across the vastness of loss and loneliness continued the equally ancient work of building home from hope. The sewing kit sat open beside her chair, its contents no longer foreign, but familiar, its tools responsive to her touch, as if they remembered the hands that had shaped them. In her lap, the quilt grew ring by ring, stitch by stitch, becoming something beautiful enough to be worthy of the love that was creating it. When she went to bed that night, Rosalie carried with her not just the satisfaction of work well done, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you belong somewhere, that your presence matters, that your hands can still create beauty, even after they have known such loss. The wooden cross on her windowsill caught the starlight, and she found herself able to pray again, not the desperate pleas of someone drowning, but the grateful words of someone who had been pulled to shore and was learning, slowly, to trust the solid ground beneath her feet. The church bell in Millbrook rang clear across the valley every Sunday morning, its bronze voice carrying across the snow-covered landscape to call the faithful to worship. From her bedroom window, Rosalie could see the thin line of smoke rising from the town's chimneys 5 miles distant, could imagine the families gathering in their Sunday best to share in fellowship and prayer. She had not heard that bell without longing since her arrival at the ranch. Once, church had been the center of her week, the place where her family joined with neighbors to celebrate births, mourn losses, and find strength for the challenges ahead. Thomas had served as deacon, Sarah had sung in the children's choir, and Rosalie had organized quilting circles and church suppers with the easy authority of a woman secure in her place in the world. Now she was a ghost, haunting the edges of community, unable to show her face where Tucker and his men might see her, dependent on others to venture into town for supplies and news. The isolation chafed against her nature, but she understood its necessity, at least until they could find a way to clear her name and bring the real killers to justice. "The Reverend Morrison asks after you," Maria reported as she unpacked supplies from the weekly trip to town. "He says the congregation has been praying for the poor woman staying at the Ashford place, ever since word got around that Senor Colt had taken in someone who needed help." This surprised Rosalie. She'd assumed that her presence at the ranch was a secret, something to be hidden from curious eyes and wagging tongues. But Colt, it seemed, had taken a different approach. "He's been telling people the truth," Maria continued, arranging canned goods in the pantry with practiced efficiency. "That you're a widow who lost her family in a fire, that you came to us, hurt and homeless, that Christian charity demanded we take you in. But if people know I'm here, they know a version of you that Senor Colt has chosen to tell," Maria interrupted gently. "A woman whose husband died in an accident at his sawmill, whose child died in the same fire that left you with injuries that stole your voice. A tragic story, but not a criminal one." The careful construction of this alternate truth impressed Rosalie with its thoughtfulness. Colt had taken the basic facts of her situation and reshaped them into something that would generate sympathy rather than suspicion, protection rather than betrayal. It was a story that explained her silence, her fragility, her need for sanctuary, without making her a target. "The whole town's talking about how good Senor Colt is to take in a stranger," Maria added with a small smile. "The ladies are bringing food, offering to help with sewing and such. Mrs. Patterson said she'd be happy to come out and sit with you, keep you company while you recover." Through the kitchen window, Rosalie could see Colt and Roberto working with 3 of the ranch hands to repair a section of fence damaged by the recent storms. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air. As they worked, their movements coordinated and efficient. Watching them, she understood more clearly the kind of man she'd found refuge with, someone who thought several moves ahead, who protected not just with strength, but with strategy. That afternoon, their first visitor arrived. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was a woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair and the brisk kindness of someone accustomed to organizing church committees and managing community crises. She drove her own buggy despite the snow, her horse picking its way carefully up the ranch road, as if it had made this journey many times before. "I've brought soup," she announced as Maria welcomed her into the kitchen, "and some of my bread, and a jar of preserves the Methodist ladies made for you. We heard about your troubles, dear, and wanted you to know you're not alone." Rosalie found herself face to face with the kind of woman who had once been her peer, a pillar of community respectability, someone who organized charity drives and knew everyone's business, but never spoke it maliciously. For a moment, the urge to confess everything was almost overwhelming. Here was someone who might understand, who might help, who represented the kind of normal life she'd lost. But then she remembered Tucker's badge and false authority, remembered how easily a lie could become accepted truth when told by the right, people in the right way. How could she know who to trust when evil wore the face of law and justice? She doesn't speak much since the fire, Maria explained gently. The smoke, it damaged her throat. But she hears everything, understands everything. Your kindness means more than you know. Mrs. Patterson's eyes softened with genuine compassion as she looked at Rosalie. Oh, you poor dear. I can't imagine what you've been through. But you're in good hands here. Colt Ashford is one of the finest men in this territory, and Maria's been looking after people longer than most of us have been drawing breath. She settled herself at the kitchen table with the comfortable authority of someone welcome in any home, and began unpacking a basket that seemed to hold half the contents of a general store. Now, I don't want you to think you have to hide away out here like some hermit, she continued, addressing Rosalie directly despite her silence. When you're feeling up to it, you'd be more than welcome at our Sunday services. Reverend Morrison does a lovely job with the healing prayers, and there's not a person in that congregation who wouldn't be honored to help you through this difficult time. The kindness was genuine. Rosalie could see that, but underneath it lay the assumption that she was exactly what Colt had told them, a victim of accident rather than murder, a widow grieving natural losses rather than someone hunted by killers, who wore badges and spoke of justice while dealing in death. The whole community's talking about taking up a collection, Mrs. Patterson went on, to help you get back on your feet when you're ready. Land's getting scarce, but there are still good homestead claims to be had if a person knows where to. Look, a woman alone has challenges, of course, but there are ways to manage if you've got the community behind you. As the afternoon wore on, other visitors arrived. Dr. Fleming, the town physician, came ostensibly to check on Rosalie's health, but really to satisfy his curiosity about the mysterious woman who'd captured Colt Ashford's protective instincts. Young Mrs. Henderson brought her infant son and a casserole, eager to share gossip and assess whether this stranger might become a rival for the eligible bachelors in the area. Each visitor brought not just gifts, but information. News of the territory, updates on neighbors' lives, and most importantly, confirmation that Tucker and his men were still in town, still asking questions, still presenting themselves as legitimate lawmen hunting a dangerous fugitive. Strangest thing, Dr. Fleming mentioned, as he accepted a cup of coffee, those marshals have been showing everyone a wanted poster, but the description doesn't match anyone I've seen around here. Makes a man wonder if they're chasing shadows. Mrs. Henderson nodded eagerly. My husband says they've been asking specifically about women traveling alone, but the woman they're looking for is supposed to be blonde and tall. Nothing like... She caught herself, realizing she was about to be rude, but the implication was clear. Through these conversations, Rosalie began to understand the delicate game Colt was playing. By introducing her to the community as someone deserving of sympathy, rather than suspicion, he'd created a network of people who would be naturally inclined to protect her rather than betray her. The wanted poster's description, deliberately vague and inaccurate, worked in their favor when people could see for themselves that the quiet, dark-haired woman at the Ashford Ranch bore no resemblance to the dangerous criminal the false marshals described. As evening approached and the visitors departed, Rosalie found herself exhausted by the effort of maintaining her silent persona while longing to join the normal conversation that had flowed around her. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the sense of being part of a community again, of having people who cared about her welfare, even if they didn't know her true story. You did well today, Colt told her, as they sat by the fire after dinner. I know it wasn't easy, staying quiet when you had things you wanted to say. She nodded, understanding that he saw more than she sometimes realized. The afternoon had been both a gift and a test. a chance to remember what normal life felt like, but also a reminder of how much she'd lost and how far she still had to go to reclaim it. "They're good people," he continued, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "When the time comes, when we've dealt with Tucker and his men, they'll be the ones who help you build a new life. But for now, they're also the ones who'll help keep you safe, whether they know it or not." Outside, the church bell marked the evening hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a benediction. Rosalie listened to its familiar call and felt, for the first time since her world had collapsed, that she might someday find her way back to the fellowship of ordinary people living ordinary lives. But first, she would have to survive the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her here, and trust that the man sitting across from her had the wisdom and strength to see them both through the darkness that was surely coming. The shared meals at the kitchen table had become something sacred in the rhythm of their days, not the formal dining room with its polished mahogany and china that spoke of special occasions, but the worn pine table where Maria had fed 3 generations of Ashford men, where honest work was followed by honest food, and the kind of conversation that built families from strangers. Colt had taken to joining them for breakfast rather than eating alone in his study, and the change seemed to soften something in him that Rosalie was only beginning to understand. She watched him across the table each morning, noting how he listened to Maria's gentle chatter about household concerns, how he included Rosalie in conversations even when she could only nod or shake her head in response. "The snow's breaking up in the lower pastures," he reported one morning as Maria refilled his coffee cup. "Won't be long before we can move the cattle to better grazing." He looked at Rosalie, including her in ranch business, as if her opinion mattered. "Spring comes late up here, but when it comes fast. Everything changes almost overnight." She found herself nodding, understanding that he was speaking of more than weather and seasons. Change was coming to their careful sanctuary, and they all felt it approaching like a storm on the distant horizon. But sitting at this table, watching steam rise from their coffee cups while snow whispered against the windows, she felt ready to face whatever might come. As February gave way to March, their evening routine evolved into something more intimate than the general gatherings in the great room. After Roberta retired to the bunkhouse and Maria to her small apartment behind the kitchen, Colt and Rosalie found themselves alone together in the quiet hours before bed. At first, these moments had been filled with awkward silences and careful distance, but gradually they began to share the deeper truths that only emerged when darkness offered the safety of privacy. Colt spoke of the war with halting words that painted pictures of brotherhood forged in battle and innocence lost in places whose names still made his jaw tighten. He told her about friends who hadn't come home, about decisions that haunted him, about the way a man learned to carry guilt and grief without letting them crush his spirit. "I enlisted thinking I was going to save the Union," he said one night, as they sat by the dying fire. "Came home, understanding that mostly I'd just learned how to kill people who were probably no worse than me, just unlucky enough to be born on the wrong side of a line somebody else had drawn." Rosalie listened with the attention of someone who understood that pain shared was pain lessened, even if words couldn't undo what had been done. She began to see that his careful control, his measured way of moving through the world, came from a man who had learned not to trust his own capacity for violence. "The ranch saved me," he continued, his eyes focused on the glowing embers. "Gave me something to build instead of something to tear down. But I never thought I'd find someone who—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. But she heard what he couldn't yet say. Her own sharing came more slowly, filtered through the trauma that had stolen her voice and the fear that had driven her across half of Colorado. But gradually, she began to speak of her life before the murders, not the tragic facts that everyone now knew, but the smaller, sweeter memories that only someone who loved her would want to hear. She told him about Thomas's laugh, how it could fill a room and make everyone else smile without knowing why. About Sarah's habit of talking to butterflies as if they were old friends, about the way she'd insisted on wearing her Sunday dress to feed the chickens because they deserved to see something pretty too. She wanted to learn to read music, Rosalie whispered one night, her fingers tracing patterns on the table between them. There was a piano in town at the church, and she'd begged me to take her there just to listen when the organist practiced. She said music looked like dancing on paper. These conversations became a ritual of trust, each shared memory and painful truth weaving them closer together. Colt began to understand that her silence wasn't just trauma, but protection, a way of keeping the most precious parts of herself safe from a world that had proven it could destroy anything beautiful without warning. And Rosalie began to see that his careful reserve wasn't coldness, but consideration, the restraint of a man who had learned that his actions carried weight, that his words had power to help or harm, that love was something to be offered with steady hands rather than desperate. Grasping. The nightmares came irregularly, but always with devastating force. Rosalie would wake gasping, her body rigid with terror, the phantom smell of smoke filling her nostrils and the sound of Sarah's screams echoing in her ears. The first time it happened, she'd bitten her pillow to muffle her cries, afraid of waking the household and revealing the depth of her brokenness. But Colt heard anyway. He appeared at her door in his nightshirt and pants hastily pulled on, his hair disheveled and his eyes alert with concern. "Ma'am," he called softly through the closed door. "Are you all right?" She couldn't answer, couldn't find breath enough for words, but somehow he understood. She heard his footsteps retreat and then return, heard the soft scrape of a chair being positioned outside her door. "I'll be right here," he said quietly. "You're safe now. Just listen to my voice and remember where you are." And he stayed there until dawn, occasionally speaking in low, soothing tones about ordinary things, the sound of wind in the pines, the way moonlight painted the snow, the gentle breathing of horses in the barn. His presence beyond the door became an anchor that kept her from drowning in the tide of memory and fear. After the third nightmare, she found the courage to open the door when she heard his chair scraping across the floor. He looked up from where he sat reading by lamplight, his expression gentle and undemanding. "Would it help if I sat inside?" he asked. "Sometimes being alone with the darkness makes it worse." She nodded, stepping back to let him enter her sanctuary. He positioned his chair by the window where he could watch for danger while she found her way back to peace, and gradually this too became part of their routine. When the nightmares came, he would appear with his quiet strength and steady presence, never asking questions, never demanding explanations, simply offering the gift of not being alone with her terror. "My father used to sit with me like this," she told him one night after the worst of the fear had passed. "When I was small and scared of thunder, he said storms always pass, but they pass easier when you don't have to weather them alone." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Colt replied. "Mine used to say something similar, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face what scares you." As winter began its slow retreat and the first hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days, their relationship deepened into something neither quite had words for. Not yet love, perhaps, but something that might grow into love, given time and safety and the continued gift of understanding. They worked together now with an ease that spoke of partnership. Colt would consult her about household decisions, and she would offer suggestions about ranch management with the practical wisdom of someone who had helped run a business. When he planned the spring planting, she sketched garden layouts based on what she'd learned about the mountain growing season. When she struggled with a particularly difficult section of the quilt, he would hold the lamp to give her better light, his presence comfortable and undemanding. "You know," he said one evening, as they sat at their table after another peaceful supper, "I never thought I'd find someone who could make this house feel like home again." Rosalie looked up from the mending in her lap, meeting his eyes across the space that no longer felt empty, but full of possibility. "I never thought I'd have a home again," she replied softly. "But this place, these people, it's given me back something I thought was lost forever." Outside, the snow continued its ancient work of covering the world in clean white silence. Inside, two people who had learned that love could be lost in an instant also learned that it could be found again, built slowly and carefully on a foundation of trust and mutual respect, and the courage to believe that not all stories had to end in sorrow. The kitchen table between them held the remnants of their shared meal, the evidence of ordinary life continuing despite extraordinary circumstances. And in that ordinary moment, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a house settling into evening peace, they both felt the stirring of something that might, given time and grace, grow strong enough to weather whatever storms the future might bring. The telegraph message arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, delivered by young Jimmy Crawford, who rode the 20 miles from town with the urgency of someone carrying news too important to delay. His horse was lathered with sweat, despite the cool morning air, and his face was flushed with the excitement of being part of something significant. "Message for Mr. Ashford," he announced, dismounting in the ranch yard where Colt was overseeing the repair of winter storm damage. "From Sheriff Mackenzie in Colorado Springs. He said to tell you it was urgent." Colt accepted the yellow telegraph, paper with steady hands, but Rosalie, watching from the kitchen window, could see the tension that crept into his shoulders as he read. The message was brief, but its implications were enormous. "Tucker not legitimate marshal. Stop wanted for murder in Texas. Stop bringing real authorities. Stop hold position. Stop Mackenzie." The relief that flooded through Rosalie was so intense it left her knees weak. After months of living as a hunted criminal, official vindication felt like a miracle. But Colt's expression as he approached the house suggested the situation was more complicated than simple vindication. "It's good news and bad news," he told her as they gathered in the kitchen with Maria and Roberto. "Sheriff Mackenzie got my telegram asking him to investigate Tucker's credentials. Turns out our instincts were right. Tucker and his men are wanted for a string of murders across 3 territories, land grabs mostly, targeting families with valuable property and no close relatives to ask questions. Then I'm free," Rosalie whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "If they're the criminals, if there's proof, you're innocent." "Yes," Colt confirmed. "But Mackenzie says Tucker's gotten wind that someone's been asking questions about him. Word is he's planning to leave the territory, but not before tying up loose ends." The implication hit her like a physical blow. Tucker knew his time was running out, knew that legitimate law enforcement was closing in. A man in his position would want to eliminate the only witness who could connect him to his crimes, even if it meant abandoning his careful masquerade and resorting to open violence. "How long before the real authorities arrive?" Roberto asked, his weathered hands already moving to check the rifle he kept propped near the door. "Mackenzie's riding with a federal marshal and 2 deputies, Colt replied. "But they're coming from Colorado Springs, and the mountain passes are still tricky this time of year. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns. And Tucker could be here tonight for all we know." Colt moved to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting to see riders approaching at any moment. "Jimmy says the 3 of them cleared out of the hotel this morning, told the clerk they had urgent business to attend to." The peaceful world they'd built over the past months suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. Rosalie thought of the quilt upstairs, half-finished in its frame, of the garden plans she'd sketched for spring planting, of the quiet evening conversations that had become the cornerstone of her healing. All of it could be destroyed by 3 men who saw her life as nothing more than an obstacle to their escape. "We need to get word to the neighbors," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Fleming, the others. If they don't know the truth about Tucker, they might try to help him when he comes asking questions." Colt nodded approvingly. "Roberto, Can you ride to the Henderson place? They've got the fastest horses, and young Tom can spread word to the other ranches. Tell them we've got word that the men claiming to be marshals are actually wanted criminals, and that real law enforcement is on the way. Si, Senor Colt, I go now. Roberto was already reaching for his coat, his movements quick and purposeful. What? About the church bell? Maria suggested. In the old country, when bandits came, the church bells would ring to warn everyone. Perhaps Reverend Morrison... Good thinking, Colt agreed. If you see the Reverend Roberto, tell him that if he hears gunfire from our direction, ring that bell long and hard. The whole valley will know something's wrong. As Roberto rode out, his horse's hooves drumming against the still frozen ground, the remaining members of the household began their final preparations. The careful planning they'd done over the past weeks now took on desperate urgency as they transformed their home into a fortress. Colt distributed rifles to each of the ranch hands, men who had worked cattle and horses for years, but who understood that today they might be called upon to defend lives as well as livestock. He positioned lookouts at strategic points around the property, establishing signals that would warn of approaching riders while allowing the defenders to remain hidden. Maria and Rosalie worked together to prepare supplies that might be needed. For a siege, medical supplies in case of wounds, food and water that could be reached quickly, ammunition counted and distributed to positions throughout the house and barn. I've been thinking, Rosalie said as they worked, her voice quiet but determined. If Tucker comes, he'll want to take me alive if possible. A dead witness can't recant testimony, but a living one can be made to confess to whatever story he wants to tell. Colt looked up sharply from the rifle he was cleaning. What are you suggesting? That we use that to our advantage? If I'm what he wants, if I'm the bait that brings him into the open? She met his gaze steadily, despite the fear that made her hands tremble. Maybe we can end this once and for all. Absolutely not. His voice carried the flat authority of a military commander facing an unacceptable proposal. I didn't pull you out of that snow to hand you over to the men who destroyed your family. I'm not talking about surrender, she replied. I'm talking about justice. For Thomas, for Sarah, for all the other families these men have murdered. If we can capture Tucker alive, he can be made to confess to his crimes, the real crimes, with real evidence. The logic was sound, but the risk was enormous. Using Rosalie as bait would require exposing her to the very men who had already tried to kill her once. One mistake, one moment of bad timing, and she would be lost forever. There has to be another way, Colt said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. As the afternoon wore on, tensions stretched taut as wire around the ranch. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of settling timbers, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the whisper of wind through the pines. The men took turns at watch, their eyes constantly scanning the approaches to the ranch for any sign of movement. When the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink that should have been beautiful but felt ominous, one of the lookouts signaled from his position near the main gate. 3 riders were approaching from the east, moving at the steady pace of men who were no longer concerned with stealth or pretense. Tucker had decided that the time for masquerade was over. Positions, Colt called quietly, and the ranch hands melted into the defensive positions they'd rehearsed. From the outside, the ranch would appear normal, peaceful, undefended. But every approach was covered, every escape route blocked. Rosalie took her position at the kitchen window, where she could see the approaching riders while remaining hidden behind the curtains Maria had carefully arranged. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized Tucker's lean form in the lead. But beneath the fear was something harder, stronger. A burning desire to see justice done for the family she'd lost. The 3 men stopped at the main gate, but this time they didn't dismount or call out greetings. Tucker simply studied the ranch buildings with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing his prey. Then he spurred his horse forward, his companions following close behind. The final confrontation was beginning, and Rosalie found herself praying not for rescue, but for the strength to see it through to the end. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but whether the ghosts of Thomas and Sarah would finally find the peace that only justice could bring. The telegraph message lay on the kitchen table where Colt had left it, its yellow paper seeming to glow in the lamplight like a promise that truth would ultimately prevail. But first, they would have to survive long enough for that truth to matter. Outside, Tucker and his men rode steadily toward the house, their shadows stretching long across the snow as the sun touched the mountain peaks. Inside, people who had chosen to become family, prepared to defend each other with their lives. The peaceful sanctuary was about to become a battlefield, but Rosalie no longer felt like a helpless victim waiting for rescue. She felt like a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The wildflower bouquet sat in a mason jar on the kitchen windowsill, its delicate blooms almost impossibly bright against the backdrop of snow that still clung to the shadowed places beneath the pines. Colt had picked them that morning from the protected hollow behind the barn, where the first brave flowers of spring had pushed through the earth, their faces turned toward the strengthening sun like prayers made visible. It was the first romantic gesture he had ever made toward her, simple and unpracticed, but carrying the weight of all the words that had remained unspoken between them through the long winter of healing. The flowers, mountain lupine and Indian paintbrush, wild columbine and tiny alpine forget-me-nots, spoke of careful attention to beauty, of a man who had noticed what brought light to a woman's eyes. Rosalie touched the petals gently, understanding that this small offering represented something much larger. In the language of courtship that had governed her previous life, it would have been a minor gesture, easily overlooked among grander displays of affection. But in the context of their careful dance around each other's wounded hearts, it felt as significant as a formal declaration. "They'll not last long," Colt said from the doorway, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a man venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Spring flowers never do, but I thought, while they were here," he trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. But she heard everything he couldn't yet say. That beauty was precious precisely because it was temporary, that after months of winter, the first flowers felt like promises of better days ahead, that sometimes a man needed to pick flowers for a woman simply because she deserved to have beautiful things in her life again. "They're perfect," she said softly, meeting his eyes across the kitchen that had become the heart of their shared world. "Thank you." The distance between them seemed to pulse with possibility. For weeks they had been moving toward this moment. Through small gestures and careful words, through shared meals and quiet conversations, through the gradual building of trust that allowed two wounded souls to contemplate the risk of loving again, but the approaching threat that had dominated. Their morning suddenly felt far away, pushed aside by the simple fact of flowers on a windowsill and the way afternoon light painted gold across a man's face as he looked at a woman as if she might be the answer to prayers he'd forgotten he was praying. "Rosalie," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different somehow, weighted with meaning that made her heart quicken. "There's something I need to tell you. Before whatever's coming arrives at our gate." She set down the dish towel she'd been holding, giving him her full attention. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of ranch life continuing, cattle lowing in the distance, the ring of hammer on metal from the barn where Roberto was shoeing horses. But inside this kitchen, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the words that needed saying. "I know the timing isn't right," he continued, moving closer but stopping just beyond arm's reach, as if afraid to presume too much. "I know you're still healing from losses that would break a lesser person. I know there are men riding toward us who want to do you harm, and I know tomorrow isn't promised to any of us." She could see him gathering his courage, this man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, but who struggled now to speak the truth of his heart. "But I also know that I've spent too many years living like a ghost in my own life. keeping everyone at a distance, because I was afraid of losing them. And you, he paused, his grey eyes holding hers with steady intention. You've shown me that a person can lose everything and still find the strength to build something new. You've made this house feel like home again. Made me remember what it feels like to care about someone more than I care about protecting myself. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Rosalie felt her throat tighten with emotions too complex for easy naming, gratitude and fear, and the tentative stirring of something that might, given time and safety, grow into the kind of love that could last a lifetime. Colt, she whispered, his name feeling natural on her lips for the first time since she'd known him. I'm not asking for promises, he said quickly, as if afraid she might feel pressured by his declaration. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just needed you to know that whatever happens when those men arrive, you won't face it alone. Not because I'm honorable or dutiful or any of those things people say about me in town, but because I love you. The simple words, spoken with the quiet conviction of a man who had thought them through carefully, seemed to reshape the very air around them. Love. Not the desperate passion of youth, but the considered choice of adults who had known loss and chosen to risk their hearts again. I love you too, she said, the admission coming easier than she'd expected. I didn't think I could feel this way again. Didn't think I deserved to feel this way after failing to protect my family. But you've shown me that love isn't something we earn or lose based on what we've done. It's something we choose to give and receive, again and again, even when the world tries to convince us we don't deserve it. The space between them disappeared as he crossed the kitchen floor, his hands reaching for hers with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. When their fingers intertwined, she felt the calluses earned through years of honest work, felt the strength that had built a ranch from wilderness and offered sanctuary to a broken stranger. If we survive what's coming, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, if we find our way through to the other side of this, will you consider making this your home, not as a guest or someone we're helping, but as the woman of this house, as my wife? The proposal was characteristically direct, without flowery speeches or grand gestures, but carrying the solid weight of a man who meant every word. Marriage. The chance to build a new family from the ashes of the old, to create something lasting and good in a world that had shown them both how quickly everything could be destroyed. Yes, she said, the word coming without hesitation despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. Yes, I'll marry you, Colt Ashford. I'll help you turn this house into a home. I'll stand beside you through whatever storms come, and I'll love you with everything I have left to give. When he kissed her, it was with the gentle intensity of a man who had learned to treasure what was precious, to handle love like the fragile and powerful thing it was. The kiss tasted of coffee and morning air, of promises made in the face of uncertainty and hope, chosen despite every reason for despair. They held each other in the kitchen, where they had shared so many meals and quiet conversations, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had already begun building together. The wildflowers seemed to glow more brightly in their jar, as if responding to the love that had finally been spoken aloud. We should tell Maria, Rosalie said eventually, laughing softly at the practical thought that intruded on the romance of the moment. She'll want to start planning a wedding. After, Colt replied, his arms still around her, his forehead resting against hers. After we deal with Tucker and his men, after the real authorities arrive and clear your name officially, after we're sure the future we're planning will actually be possible. She nodded, understanding that love declared in the face of danger felt different from love celebrated in safety. They were making promises to each other without knowing if they would live to keep them. But perhaps that made the promises more rather than less meaningful. Outside, the afternoon was advancing toward evening, and with it the likelihood that their private moment of joy would be interrupted by the harsh realities of the world beyond the ranch gates. But for now, they stood together in the kitchen that had become their sanctuary, holding each other and the future they hoped to share. The flowers on the windowsill caught the slanting light. Their delicate faces turned toward the sun like prayers, for the chance to bloom fully before winter came again. And in the arms of the man who had saved her life and then shown her how to live it again, Rosalie felt her own face turning toward the light, her own heart opening to possibilities she had thought were lost forever. Love had found them despite everything, despite loss and trauma and the men who rode toward them carrying death and destruction. It had found them in the quiet spaces between words, in shared meals and gentle touches, in the decision to trust again despite every reason not to. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, she thought as Colt's hand smoothed over her hair with infinite tenderness, made all the difference in the world. The legal documents were hidden in the secret compartment of the locket with an ingenuity that spoke of desperate foresight. As Tucker and his men approached the house, Rosalie worked the tiny mechanism with trembling fingers, revealing papers folded so small they seemed impossible to read. But when she spread them carefully on the kitchen table, the faded ink told a story that changed everything. "Land grant," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she traced the official seals and signatures. Signed by the territorial governor himself, 2,000 acres of timber rights along the Arkansas River granted to Marcus Finch in 1875. Colt leaned over her shoulder, studying the documents with the sharp attention of a man who understood. The details could mean the difference between life and death. What he saw there made his jaw tighten with grim understanding. "Your father," he said. "It wasn't a question." "My maiden name was Finch," Rosalie confirmed, her finger pointing to a line that made everything clear. "When I married Thomas, I took his name, became Rosalie Miller. But these lands, this timber grant, it was my inheritance. My father died before he could claim it, and it passed to me as his only child." The magnitude of what Tucker had been, after suddenly became clear. This wasn't just about a sawmill or a house by the river. This was about one of the largest timber grants in the territory, land rights that would be worth a fortune to men who knew how to exploit them. And the only legal heir was a woman who carried the proof of her birthright in a locket around her neck. "They killed Thomas and Sarah to get to me," she said, her voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "But they needed me to disappear completely, not just die, but be discredited so thoroughly that no one would ever question their claim to the land. A murderous wife who died in the fire she set would be perfect. No heirs, no questions, no one to contest their fraudulent claim." Maria crossed herself silently, understanding flooding her features as she realized the scope of the evil they were facing. "But why wait so long?" she asked. "Why not file the claim immediately after the fire?" "Because they needed time for the story to settle," Colt said, his military mind working through the strategy. "Time for people to accept that Rosalie Miller was dead. Time for the territorial records to be updated. Time for any potential witnesses to move on or forget details. Then they could emerge as the rightful claimants, complete with forged documents showing they'd purchased the rights from Marcus Finch before his death." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their urgent conference. Through the kitchen window, they could see Tucker and his men had reached the main yard, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. But instead of the 3 riders they'd been expecting, 5 men sat in their saddles, their faces hard with the confidence of predators who believed they held all the advantages. "They brought reinforcements," Roberto observed grimly from his position near the back door. "This is not good." But Rosalie felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not fear, but a cold, clean anger that burned away the last of her victims. Helplessness. For months, she'd been running from these men, hiding from their lies, letting them control the narrative of her life. Now, with the legal proof of her identity in her hands and the truth finally clear, she felt ready to face them. As the rightful heir to Marcus Finch's legacy, "They can bring a dozen men," she said quietly, carefully folding the documents and returning them to the locket's hidden compartment. "It doesn't change the fact that they're thieves and murderers, and we can prove it." Tucker's voice carried. Across the yard, as he called toward the house, his tone stripped of any pretense of lawful authority. "Mrs. Miller, we know you're in there. Time to stop playing games and come out where we can have ourselves a conversation." The use of her married name was deliberate, Rosalie realized, an attempt to maintain the fiction that she was a fugitive from justice rather than the legal heir to valuable property. But she also heard something else in his voice, urgency, perhaps even desperation. He knew that real law enforcement was coming, knew that his time was running out. "You hear that?" she called back, her voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. "He's still calling me Mrs. Miller, still pretending he doesn't know who I really am." Tucker's reaction was immediate and telling. The confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating killer beneath. "Don't try to confuse things with clever words, woman. You're wanted for murder, and we're here to bring you in." "I'm Rosalie Finch," she called back, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Daughter of Marcus Finch, legal heir to the timber grant you've been trying to steal, and you're Tucker Morrison, wanted for murder in 3 territories, including the murder of my husband and daughter." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Tucker's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, perhaps beginning to understand that their leader had involved them in something far more complicated than a simple manhunt. And Tucker himself sat frozen for a long moment, clearly calculating his options. When he spoke again, all pretense had been abandoned. "Makes no difference what you call yourself or what papers you think you've got. Dead women don't inherit land, and after today, you'll be just another tragic victim of frontier violence. The territorial authorities know you're here." Colt called from beside the kitchen door, his rifle visible in his hands. "Sheriff Mackenzie and a federal marshal are riding from Colorado Springs. You've got maybe 2 days before they arrive, and when they do, every person in this valley will be able to testify to what happened here." Tucker's laugh was harsh and without humor. 2 days is plenty of time to finish our business and be across the border into New Mexico. Nobody's going to miss one more dead rancher and his lying whore." The crude words hit like a physical blow. But Rosalie felt Colt's steadying presence beside her, felt the protection of Maria and Roberto, and the ranch hands who had chosen to stand with them. She was no longer the broken woman who had stumbled through the snow with bare feet and empty hands. She was surrounded by people who loved her, armed with the truth of her identity, and facing men whose lies were finally being exposed to the light. "There's something else," she said, loud enough for Tucker and his men to hear. "Something you don't know about those timber rights." Tucker leaned forward in his saddle, his interest clearly caught despite himself. "My father was careful about legal protections," Rosalie continued, improvising now, but building on truths she hoped were solid. "The grant requires annual reports to the territorial office, signed affidavits from the legal heir. Miss even 1 year, and the rights revert to the territory for redistribution." It was a bluff, but based on what she remembered of her father's meticulous attention to legal details, and judging by the expression on Tucker's face, it was a bluff that hit home. "You're lying," he called, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "The next report is due in 6 weeks, she replied. "Only I can sign it. Kill me, and you lose everything you've worked for. Let me live, and maybe we can come to some arrangement." It was a dangerous game she was playing, but she could see it working. Tucker's men were looking at him now with questions in their eyes, wondering if their leader had led them into a trap that could cost them the fortune they'd been promised. The legal documents in her locket were real, and they proved her identity, beyond any doubt. But more than that, they represented the power of truth to stand against lies, of legal right to oppose criminal wrong. Tucker had built his scheme on the assumption that he could control the narrative, could make the world believe his version of events through violence and intimidation. But truth, once spoken clearly and supported by evidence, had a power that even killers couldn't destroy. And in the growing silence that followed her revelation, Rosalie felt the balance of power beginning to shift in ways that Tucker was only now beginning to understand. The land deed tucked in the locket's most secret compartment was written in her father's careful hand, witnessed by the territorial governor himself, and sealed with wax that still bore the impression of official authority. As Rosalie held it up to the light streaming through the kitchen window, the magnitude of what Tucker had been willing to kill for became devastatingly clear. 2,000 acres of prime timberland, she read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Water rights to 3 miles of the Arkansas River, mineral rights to any deposits discovered on the property. Estimated value? She paused, the number almost too large to comprehend. $50,000. Colt let out a low whistle. In 1887, $50,000 represented more wealth than most men would see in several lifetimes. It was the kind of money that could buy silence, corrupt officials, and finance the elaborate deception Tucker had constructed around the murders of her family. "There's more," she continued, studying the fine print that had seemed unimportant when her father first explained the inheritance to her. The grant includes development rights for a railroad spur. Any company wanting to transport timber out of the mountains would need access through this land. The railroad connection changed everything. The coming of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad to Colorado meant that timber previously too remote to harvest profitably could now be shipped to markets across the country. What had been valuable land when her father received the grant had become a potential fortune with the expansion of rail transportation. "That's why they needed you gone completely," Colt said, the pieces falling into place with grim clarity. "Not just dead, but discredited as a criminal whose heirs could never make a legal claim. They probably have buyers lined up, railroad interests ready to pay premium prices for guaranteed access." Through the window, they could see Tucker conferring with his men, their voices low but their gestures increasingly agitated. The revelation of Rosalie's true identity and the legal complexities it represented had clearly disrupted their simple plan of murder and theft. "He's calculating," Roberto observed from his watch position, wondering if he can still salvage the situation. But Rosalie was beginning to understand that Tucker's desperation made him more dangerous, not less. A man facing the loss of $50,000 and a lifetime in prison for murder would be willing to take enormous risks to protect his investment. "They'll try to force me to sign something," she said quietly. "Some kind of document transferring the rights to them. Make it look legal, even if it's signed under duress." "Over my dead body," Colt replied grimly. "That might be exactly what they're planning." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their urgent planning, but these riders were coming from the north, not the south, where Tucker's men waited. Roberto peered through the curtains, then broke into a relieved smile. "Riders from the Henderson place," he reported, "and behind them, more coming from town." Word had spread faster than they'd hoped. The neighbors who had welcomed Rosalie into their community with such kindness were now riding to her defense, bringing rifles and determination, and the kind of frontier justice that had built the territory. Tom Henderson led the group, his young face set with grim purpose. Behind him rode Dr. Fleming, Reverend Morrison, and half a dozen other men from town, whose faces Rosalie recognized from her careful glimpses through curtained windows. They formed a rough semicircle behind Tucker's group, effectively surrounding the would-be killers. "Tucker Morrison," Tom called out, his voice carrying the authority of righteous anger. "We got word you and your men aren't the lawmen you claim to be. Sheriff Mackenzie sent a telegram saying you're wanted for murder." Tucker's response was to reach for his gun, but the click of multiple rifles being cocked around him made him freeze with his hand halfway to his holster. "Now that would be a mistake," Dr. Fleming said calmly, his medical training having taught him to remain steady in crisis situations. "You're outnumbered 3-1, and every man here knows how to shoot. This is none of your business, Tucker snarled, but his confidence was cracking like ice in spring sunshine. This woman is a criminal wanted for— This woman is Rosalie Finch, Reverend Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the moral authority of his calling. Daughter of Marcus Finch, legal heir to the timber grant her father received from the territorial government. We've seen the documents, and we know the truth about who the real criminals are. The lie was smoothly told and perfectly timed. While the neighbors hadn't actually seen the documents hidden in Rosalie's locket, their united front created the impression of community knowledge and support that made Tucker's position untenable. You killed her family to steal her inheritance, Tom Henderson added, his young voice shaking with controlled fury. Murdered a decent man and his little girl for money. There's a special place in hell for men like you. Tucker's men were looking increasingly uncomfortable, their horses shifting restlessly as they found themselves the focus of multiple rifle barrels held by men who clearly knew how to use them. What had seemed like a simple cleanup operation was rapidly becoming a standoff they couldn't win. The federal marshal will be here tomorrow, Dr. Fleming continued conversationally, along with Sheriff Mackenzie and enough deputies to ensure a fair trial. You've got two choices, Tucker. Surrender now and face justice in a courtroom, or try to fight your way out and face justice right here. Inside the house, Rosalie felt tears of gratitude blurring her vision. These people, neighbors who barely knew her, community members who had accepted her based on nothing more than Colt's word and their own generous hearts, were risking their lives to protect her. It was the kind of solidarity that built civilizations. Came from wilderness that turned collections of individuals into communities worth defending. There's something else you should know, Tucker, she called through the window, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. I've already sent copies of the legal documents to the territorial capital. The governor's office has been notified of my father's death and my identity as his heir. Even if you kill everyone here today, the land rights can never be yours. Its book was another calculated bluff, but based on truths that gave it weight. Her father had been meticulous about legal protections, and it was entirely believable that such safeguards existed. Tucker's face went white with rage and understanding. Everything he'd worked for, all the murders he'd committed, the elaborate deception he'd maintained, all of it was collapsing around him like a house built on sand. You lying bitch, he snarled, his gun clearing its holster despite the rifles trained on him. If I can't have the land, nobody can. But the shot that rang out didn't come from Tucker's pistol. Tom Henderson's rifle spoke first, the bullet taking Tucker in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The would-be killer hit the ground hard, his gun flying from nerveless fingers to land in the snow. That's for the little girl, Tom said grimly, already working the lever to chamber another round. The next one's for her father. Tucker's men, seeing their leader down and themselves hopelessly outnumbered, raised their hands in surrender. The elaborate scheme that had cost so many lives was finally over, brought down not by federal marshals or territorial authorities, but by ordinary people who had decided that enough was enough. As Colt emerged from the house to help secure the prisoners, Rosalie touched the locket at her throat and felt the weight of the documents that had proven her identity and exposed the truth. Her father's careful preparation had saved her life and brought justice for her murdered family. The land grant that had cost Thomas and Sarah their lives would now fund a new beginning, a chance to build something good from the ashes of loss, to create a legacy worthy of the love that had brought her to this moment of triumph over evil. The strategic war plan spread across Colt's desk had been drawn with the precision of a man who understood that preparation could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. Maps of the ranch property marked with defensive positions, supply caches, and escape routes reflected years of military experience adapted to the realities of frontier warfare. As Tucker writhed in the snow with a shattered shoulder and his remaining men sat under the watchful rifles of angry neighbors, Colt realized that the immediate crisis was far from over. "He's got more men coming," Dr. Fleming reported after questioning the captured riders. "Tucker sent word to accomplices in New Mexico before he rode out here. Could be a dozen more killers on their way, and they'll be here by morning." The revelation hit the assembled defenders like a cold wind. What they'd thought was the end of the conflict was actually just the beginning. Tucker's operation had been larger and more organized than anyone had imagined. A network of criminals who specialized in land theft and murder, with resources and connections that extended far beyond 3 men with stolen badges. "How long do we have?" Colt asked, his military mind already shifting from celebration to tactical planning. 6 hours, maybe 8 if the mountain passes slow them down. Tom Henderson checked his rifle with the careful attention of someone who knew his life might depend on its reliability, but they'll be better armed than these 3, and they'll know we're expecting them. Rosalie stood at the kitchen window, watching, as the neighbors who had ridden to her rescue began to understand the magnitude of what they'd committed themselves to. Some had brought only hunting rifles and a handful of cartridges, expecting to face down 3 criminals, not fight a pitched battle against a gang of professional killers. "We need to evacuate the non-combatants," she said, turning back to the men gathered around Colt's desk. "Maria, the women from town who might have followed their husbands, they shouldn't be here when those men arrive." "I'm not leaving," Maria said firmly from the doorway. "This is my home. These are my people. If there's to be fighting, I stay and help." Her declaration was echoed by several other voices. Mrs. Patterson had arrived with the second wave of defenders, bringing medical supplies and a determination that matched any of the men. "I've been tending wounds since the Indian troubles of '68, she announced. "You'll need someone who knows how to dig out bullets and stitch up knife cuts." The impromptu war council that followed had the grim efficiency of people who understood. They were planning for their lives. Colt's maps were studied and refined, with local knowledge filling in details that could prove crucial. The Hendersons knew every game trail through the surrounding hills. Dr. Fleming had treated enough gunshot wounds to serve as field surgeon. Reverend Morrison had fought in the war and remembered tactics that might save them all. "The house is our strongest position," Colt explained, pointing to the defensive advantages his father had built into the structure. "Stone foundation, thick walls, clear fields of fire in all directions. But we can't let them surround us completely, or we'll be trapped." "What about the barn?" Roberto suggested. "If we can hold both buildings, create crossfire between them." "Too exposed," Tom Henderson objected. "Better to concentrate our force where we can support each other." The debate continued as the afternoon light began to fade, each man contributing knowledge earned through years of frontier living. They planned ammunition distribution, established communication signals, designated fallback positions if the main defense failed. It was the kind of careful preparation that had helped settle the West, ordinary people becoming soldiers when circumstances demanded it. But beneath the tactical discussions, Rosalie sensed a deeper current of doubt and fear. These were good men who had chosen to stand against evil, but they were ranchers and shopkeepers and doctors, not professional fighters. The men riding toward them would be killers who made their living through violence, who would show no mercy to anyone who stood in their way. "There's something I need to tell you all," she said during a break in the planning, "about what we're really fighting for." She moved to Colt's desk and carefully opened her locket, revealing the documents that proved her identity and the enormous value of the land Tucker had been trying to steal. As she explained the full scope of the inheritance, the timber rights, water access, railroad connections, she watched understanding dawn on faces around the room. $50,000, Dr. Fleming repeated softly. "No wonder they were willing to kill for it. And no wonder they won't give up easily," Tom Henderson added grimly. "Men don't walk away from that kind of money without a fight." Rosalie folded the papers carefully and returned them to the locket's hidden compartment. I want you all to understand what you're risking for me. This isn't just about protecting an innocent woman anymore. This is about standing between professional killers and a fortune that could set them up for life. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of choice. Every man in the room now knew exactly what they were facing and why. Knew that the stakes were higher than simple justice or community solidarity. It was Reverend Morrison who spoke first, his voice carrying the moral authority that had guided his congregation through decades of frontier hardships. The amount of money doesn't change what's right, he said simply. These men are murderers and thieves. They killed a good man and his little girl for profit. If we let them ride away with blood money, what does that say about the kind of community we want to build? The Reverend's right, Dr. Fleming agreed. We don't get to choose our tests of character. They choose us. This is ours. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. They would stand and fight, not because the inheritance was valuable, but because some things were worth defending regardless of their monetary worth. Justice, community, the principle that good people should be able to live without fear of evil ones. These were the real treasures being fought for. As night fell and the final preparations were completed, Rosalie found herself alone with Colt. In the kitchen, where they had shared so many quiet conversations, the wildflowers he'd picked that morning seemed to glow in the lamplight, a reminder of the love they'd declared just hours earlier. I keep thinking about Sarah, she said softly, touching the locket that held her family's photograph. About how excited she was when Thomas taught her to read. She had such plans for all the books she was going to read, all the stories she was going to write. Colt moved beside her, his hand covering hers with gentle strength. She would be proud of her mother, he said. Proud of how you've stood up. To the men who hurt your family, how you've found the courage to fight back. I'm scared, she admitted, the words coming easier now that they'd learned to trust each other with their deepest truths. Not of dying. I've been ready for that since the night I lost them. But scared of losing this, losing you, losing the chance to build something good from all this pain. Then we'd better make sure we win, he replied with the quiet confidence that had carried him through war and wilderness. We'd better make sure that when the sun rises tomorrow, we're still here to see it together. Outside, the men who had chosen to stand with them checked their weapons and said their prayers, preparing for a battle that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everything they'd worked to build. The strategic plans were complete, the positions assigned, the ammunition distributed. Now came the waiting, and with it the knowledge that morning would bring either victory or the end of everything they held dear. The signal lantern burned steady and bright in the church bell tower, its flame visible for miles across the snow-covered valley like a beacon calling good people to stand against the darkness. Reverend Morrison had volunteered to maintain the watch from the highest point in Millbrook, ready to ring the bell that would summon every able-bodied man within hearing if the battle turned against the defenders at the Ashford Ranch. Dawn was still 3 hours away when the first riders appeared on the ridgeline to the south, dark shapes moving against the star-filled sky with the purposeful advance of men who had killed before and expected to kill again. From his position in the barn loft, Roberto counted them carefully, his weathered hands steady on the telescope Colt had positioned there for reconnaissance. "Doge," he called softly across the yard to the house. 12 riders, maybe more behind. The trees, the number hit the defenders like a physical blow. Even with the neighbors who had rallied to their cause, they were outnumbered almost 2 to 1 by men who made their living through violence. But there was no turning back now. No possibility of negotiation or compromise. Tucker's reinforcements had come for blood and money, and they would accept nothing less than both. Colt moved through the house with quiet efficiency, checking on each defensive position and offering the kind of steady reassurance that had made him a leader of men in war. At the kitchen window, Dr. Fleming waited with his rifle and medical bag, ready to fight or heal as circumstances demanded. In the front parlor, Tom Henderson and two other young men from town crouched behind furniture that had been repositioned to provide cover while maintaining clear shooting lanes. "Remember what we discussed," Colt told them, his voice carrying the calm authority of experience. "Don't waste ammunition on long shots. Wait until you're sure of your target, and make every bullet count. These men are professionals, but they're not invincible." Rosalie had taken position in the upstairs bedroom that offered the best view of the approach routes, her father's old hunting rifle loaded and ready. She'd insisted on being part of the defense, despite Colt's attempts to convince her to remain in the root cellar where she'd be safer. But this was her fight more than anyone else's, her family that had been murdered, her inheritance that was being stolen. She would not cower in hiding, while others risked their lives for her cause. The approaching riders had spread out into a loose line, using the natural terrain to mask their exact numbers and intentions. They moved with the patience of predators, who understood that rushing into unknown defenses was the quickest way to lose men unnecessarily. These were not desperate criminals making a final grab for easy money. They were experienced killers who had planned this operation carefully. "They're setting up for a siege," Colt observed, watching through field glasses as the attackers established positions that would allow them to surround the ranch buildings, probably hoping to starve us out or force us to make a break for it. But the defenders had prepared for exactly this scenario. The well behind the house ensured a steady water supply, and the root cellar held enough preserved food to last for weeks. More importantly, the signal lantern in the church tower meant that help was already on the way. Sheriff Mackenzie and the federal marshal were riding hard from Colorado Springs, and every rancher within 20 miles would have seen Reverend Morrison's beacon. The psychological warfare began before the first shot was fired. One of the attackers rode forward under a white flag, stopping just within shouting distance of the house. He was a lean man, with the hard eyes of someone who had done terrible things without losing sleep over them. "You folks are making a mistake," he called toward the darkened windows. "We don't want to hurt innocent people. Just send out the woman, and we'll be on our way." "The woman has a name," Colt replied from the front porch, his rifle visible in his hands, "and she's under the protection of people who don't negotiate with murderers. This is your last chance to be reasonable," the rider continued. "We've got enough men to take this place, and when we do, everyone inside dies. The woman, the old Mexican woman, every man who chose to stand with them. Is that really what you want?" It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to create doubt and fear among defenders who might be having second thoughts about their commitment. But the response that came from multiple windows around the house showed how completely it had failed. "Come and take her," Tom Henderson called out, his young voice steady with determination. "You'll find us ready," Dr. Fleming added from the kitchen. "See, we are waiting," Roberto's voice carried from the barn, accompanied by the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. The rider studied the defensive positions for a long moment, clearly reassessing the situation. What he'd expected to find was a few frightened civilians who could be easily intimidated into surrender. Instead, he was facing prepared defenders who had chosen their ground carefully and showed no signs of backing down. "Your choice," he called back, wheeling his horse around. "But when this is over, remember that you could have ended it peacefully." As he rode back to his companions, the defenders settled in for what they knew would be a long and brutal fight. The attacking force had the advantages of numbers and professional experience, but the ranch defenders held the high ground, superior cover, and the moral certainty that came from defending home and family against those who would destroy both. "For profit. First light is when they'll come," Colt predicted, checking his pocket watch in the lamplight. "They'll want to see their targets clearly, coordinate their attack. We've got maybe 2 hours to rest before this starts in earnest, but sleep was impossible under the circumstances. Instead, the defenders used the remaining darkness to make final preparations, checking ammunition supplies, reinforcing weak points in their defenses, and saying the prayers that men say when they know they might not live to see another sunset. In her upstairs position, Rosalie opened her locket one more time and studied the photograph of her lost family. Thomas smiled back at her with the confident happiness of a man who had believed the world was fundamentally good, while Sarah's bright eyes sparkled with the joy of a child who had known only love and security. "I'm going to finish this," she whispered to their images. "The men who hurt you will face justice, and your deaths will mean something." The locket closed with a soft click, and she turned her attention back to the rifle across her knees and the dark shapes moving in the distance. Justice was coming with the dawn, carried in the hands of ordinary people who had decided that some things were worth fighting and dying for. The signal lantern in the church tower continued to burn, its steady flame a promise that help was coming, and a symbol of the light that good people could kindle even in the darkest hours. Soon, very soon, that light would be tested by forces that sought to extinguish it forever. But for now, it burned bright and steady, watched over by a minister who understood that sometimes prayers were answered not through divine intervention, but through the courage of human hearts willing to stand against evil when it came calling. Colt's father's rifle felt solid and familiar in Rosalie's hands as the first grey light of dawn crept across the Colorado mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and silver. The weapon had been passed down through 3 generations of Ashford men, its walnut stock worn smooth by decades of honest use, its barrel proven reliable in the kind of moments when a man's life depended on precision and courage. Samuel Ashford had carried this rifle during the Indian troubles of the 1860s, had used it to defend his young family and the ranch he was carving from wilderness. Colt had taken it to war, had relied on its accuracy in battles whose names were written in history books, but whose true cost was measured in the nightmares that still visited him on quiet nights. Now it rested in the hands of a woman who understood that some things were worth killing for, even when you'd rather spend your life learning to love again. The attack began with the sunrise, as Colt had predicted. The professional killers Tucker had summoned moved with coordinated precision, advancing in 3 groups designed to divide the defenders' attention and create multiple points of crisis simultaneously. They knew their business, these men who made their living from violence and death, and they approached the ranch buildings with the patient calculation of predators who had done this many times before. Roberto's rifle spoke first from the barn loft, the sharp crack of gunfire shattering the morning silence as he targeted the lead rider in the group approaching from the east. The man tumbled from his saddle with a cry that carried clearly in the cold air, and suddenly the careful choreography of the attack dissolved into the chaos of men fighting for their lives. "Here they come!" Tom Henderson shouted from the front. Arla, his rifle already tracking targets as riders burst from the tree line in a desperate charge designed to reach the house before the defenders could organize. Effective resistance. The sound of gunfire erupted from every window as the battle began in earnest. Dr. Fleming's steady hands served him well as he worked his rifle with the precision of someone who understood anatomy and knew exactly where to place shots for maximum effect. From the kitchen, Maria added her voice to the defense, wielding a shotgun with the grim efficiency of someone protecting her family. But it was from the upstairs bedroom that Rosalie made her presence felt most dramatically. The hunting rifle cracked with methodical precision as she worked through the approaching attackers, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. This was for Thomas, she thought, as one killer fell. This was for Sarah, as another spun from his saddle with a shattered shoulder. The attackers had expected to face frightened civilians who would break under pressure, but instead they found themselves caught in carefully coordinated crossfire. from defenders who held every advantage of position and preparation. The ranch buildings that had seemed like isolated targets proved to be mutually supporting fortresses, their windows and doors positioned to create killing fields that channeled attackers into carefully prepared zones of death. "They're pulling back," Tom Henderson called out as the first assault wave retreated, leaving 3 bodies in the snow and carrying 2 wounded men who might not survive to see another sunset. But Colt knew this was only the beginning. Professional killers didn't abandon profitable operations because of initial setbacks. They adapted their tactics and tried again, usually with methods that were more brutal and desperate than their first attempts. "Check your ammunition," he called to the other defenders. "This was just a probe. They'll be back with something worse." The second assault came from an unexpected direction. While half the attacking force engaged the front defenses with renewed gunfire, the other half had circled around to approach the barn from the blind spot Roberto couldn't cover from his loft position. It was a classic military maneuver, designed to force the defenders to split their attention and thin their defensive fire, but Colt had anticipated this possibility. As the attackers burst around the barn's corner, they ran directly into the crossfire from 2 ranch hands positioned in the equipment shed, their rifles speaking with the deadly accuracy of men defending their home. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was actually less than 30 minutes of the most intense violence any of them had ever experienced. Men who had lived quiet lives as ranchers and shopkeepers found themselves transformed into warriors by the simple necessity of protecting everything they held dear. From her upstairs window, Rosalie watched Colt move between defensive positions, with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to fight in places where hesitation meant death. He was everywhere at once, supporting Tom Henderson when the young man's rifle jammed, carrying ammunition to Dr. Fleming when his supply ran low, coordinating the defense with the kind of tactical brilliance that had made him legendary among his wartime comrades. The turning point came when one of the attackers managed to reach the barn and set fire to the hay stored in the lower level. Smoke began pouring from the structure, threatening to drive Roberto from his critical position and eliminate one of their key defensive advantages. But Roberto was not a man to abandon his post easily. Instead of retreating, he used the smoke as cover to change positions within the barn, emerging from unexpected angles to continue his deadly work with the rifle. His intimate knowledge of every beam and hiding place in the building turned the attacker's advantage against them, transforming the burning barn into a trap rather than a victory. As the sun climbed higher and the smoke from the barn fire drifted across the battlefield like morning fog, the sound that changed everything echoed across the valley, the deep, bronze voice of the church bell in Millbrook, ringing with the urgent rhythm that summoned help from every corner of the community. Reverend Morrison's signal brought immediate response. Riders appeared on the horizon from multiple directions as ranchers and townspeople raced toward the sound of battle, their rifles glinting in the morning sun like the weapons of an avenging army. Sheriff Mackenzie and the federal marshal were still hours away, but the community that had embraced Rosalie was riding to her defense with the united strength of people who understood that an attack on one was an attack on all. The professional killers, seeing their numerical advantage evaporating and their escape routes being cut off by arriving reinforcements, made the desperate decision that marked the true climax of the battle. Their leader, a scarred man with dead eyes who had killed for money in 3 territories, gathered his remaining men for a final suicidal assault designed to reach Rosalie before the arriving help could organize effective resistance. "They're coming for the house!" Colt shouted, recognizing the desperation in their attack formation. "Everything you've got, right now!" The final moments of the battle were decided not by tactics or superior numbers, but by the kind of individual courage that defined the best of the American frontier. As the remaining killers charged toward the house in a last desperate gambit, Every defender rose to meet them with a ferocity born of protecting family and home. Rosalie's rifle spoke with deadly precision as she targeted the lead attacker, her shot taking him center mass and sending him tumbling from his saddle just yards from the front porch. Tom Henderson's rifle jammed at the crucial moment, but he drew his pistol and continued fighting with the grim determination of youth defending the future he planned to build. Dr. Fleming abandoned his medical training for the duration of the fight, his rifle working with mechanical precision as he defended not just the house, but the community that depended on his healing skills. And Maria, the quiet woman who had welcomed a stranger into her kitchen, proved that protection of family could turn anyone into a warrior when the stakes were high enough. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, 9 of the 12 attackers lay dead in the snow around the ranch buildings. 2 more were wounded so badly they would never threaten anyone again, and the last had thrown down his weapons in surrender when he realized that continued resistance meant certain death. The cost of victory had been paid in blood and courage, but it had been paid willingly by people who understood that some things could not be purchased at any price. Justice for the murdered, safety for the innocent, and the right of good people to build peaceful lives without fear of evil ones. These were the true treasures that had been defended and preserved. As the church bell continued to ring across the valley and dust clouds marked the approach of additional help, Rosalie stood in the upstairs window with her father's rifle still warm in her hands, looking out at a battlefield where justice had finally been served. The men who had murdered her family were dead or captured, and the inheritance they had killed to steal would now fund the kind of life Thomas and Sarah would have wanted her to build. The confrontation was over, but the healing could finally begin. The wedding rings were simple gold bands, forged by the blacksmith in Millbrook from metal that had been in his family for 2 generations. They carried no elaborate engravings or precious stones, but they possessed something far more valuable, the blessing of a community that had watched 2 wounded souls find healing in each other's love, and the promise of a future built on the solid foundation of shared trials and mutual respect. 3 months had passed since the battle that ended Tucker's reign of terror. 3 months of legal proceedings that officially cleared Rosalie's name and established her rightful claim to her father's inheritance. The territorial governor himself had written a letter of apology for the ordeal she'd endured, and the federal marshal had personally delivered the deed that confirmed her ownership of the most valuable timber grant in Colorado territory. But the true healing had come not from legal vindication or financial security, but from the quiet work of building a life with people who had chosen to love her when she had nothing to offer but a broken heart and a dangerous past. The Ashford Ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It had become home in the deepest sense of the word, a place where past sorrows could be honored without being allowed to poison future joys. The wedding ceremony took place in the great room of the ranch house, with Reverend Morrison officiating, and the entire community gathered to witness the union of 2 people who had found each other across the vast landscape of loss and loneliness. Maria had spent weeks preparing, her joy in the event evident in every carefully planned detail, from the flowers adorning the mantelpiece to the feast that would follow the ceremony. Rosalie wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Patterson and the other ladies of Millbrook had sewn together in the spirit of frontier cooperation that had sustained their community through countless challenges. It was simple but elegant, its clean lines speaking of new beginnings rather than elaborate pretense. At her throat, she wore the silver locket that had carried her through the darkest period of her life, but now it held not just memories of loss, but the promise of love renewed. Colt stood beside her in his finest suit, his grey eyes holding the quiet happiness of a man who had never expected to find such contentment. The war medals he'd earned through courage and sacrifice remained locked in his desk drawer, but the real measure of his character was evident in the way he looked at his bride, with the tender protection of someone who understood how precious and fragile love could be. Dearly beloved, Reverend Morrison began, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone who had witnessed the full arc of their journey from strangers to family. We are gathered here today to celebrate not just the union of two hearts, but the triumph of hope over despair, of love over loss, of the human spirit's capacity to heal and grow stronger through adversity. The words seemed to encompass more than just the couple standing before him. They spoke to everyone in the room who had participated in the long process of healing that had brought them all to this moment. Tom Henderson, who had found courage he didn't know he possessed. Dr. Fleming, who had learned that sometimes healing required fighting before it could begin. Roberto and Maria, who had discovered that family could be chosen as well as born. When the time came for vows, Colt spoke first, his voice steady and sure despite the emotion that roughened its edges. Rosalie, I promise to love you not in spite of the sorrows you've known, but because those sorrows have shaped you into the woman of courage and grace who stands before me today. I promise to honor the memory of those you've lost by helping you build a life worthy of their love. I promise to stand beside you through whatever storms may come and to be the shelter you can turn to when the world grows cold. Rosalie's response came through tears that spoke not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the unexpected gift of second chances. Colt, you found me in the snow when I had given up hope of ever being found. You gave me shelter when I was homeless, family when I was alone, and love when I thought my heart was too broken to heal. I promise to love you with the same steadiness you've shown me, to support your dreams as you've supported mine, and to build with you the kind of home where love can flourish and grow stronger with each passing year. The rings they exchanged were blessed not just by the minister's words, but by the understanding that they represented a commitment forged in the crucible of shared adversity. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by people who had risked their lives to make this moment possible. The celebration that followed reflected the character of the community that had embraced them, generous, joyful, and grounded in the simple pleasures that made frontier life worth living. Maria's feast featured dishes that drew from her Mexican heritage and the ranch's abundant resources, while Roberto's guitar provided music that spoke of distant places and eternal longings fulfilled. As evening approached and the guests began the journey back to their own homes and families, Colt and Rosalie found themselves alone in the kitchen where so much of their courtship had unfolded. The wildflowers he'd picked months earlier had long since faded, but new blooms from their spring garden filled mason jars throughout the house, evidence of the life they were cultivating together. The quilt is finished, Rosalie told him, gesturing toward the parlor where the completed wedding ring pattern hung displayed like a work of art. All those months of work, all those tiny stitches, and now it's ready to keep us warm for the rest of our lives. Colt studied the intricate pattern of interlocking rings, each one perfectly joined to its neighbors in an endless chain of connection and commitment. Your mother would have been proud, he said, and mine too. She always said a quilt wasn't finished until it was being used by people who loved each other. The timber rights that had cost so many lives would now fund the expansion of the ranch and the building of a sawmill that would employ half the men in the valley. But more importantly, they would create a legacy of responsible stewardship that honored the memory of Marcus Finch and the family who had died protecting what he'd worked to build. I've been thinking about names, Rosalie said quietly, her hand moving to rest over her still flat belly where new life was already beginning to grow. If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Sarah after my daughter, and if it's a boy, Thomas, Colt finished, understanding immediately. It's perfect. They should be remembered, honored by the children who will carry their names into the future. As they sat together in the kitchen that had become the heart of their shared world, watching the last light of their wedding day fade over the mountains that had sheltered their love, both understood that this was not really an ending, but a beginning. The sorrows that had brought them together would always be part of their story, but they would not be the whole story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. The ordinary work of building a life together and raising children who would know they were loved and safe. There would be cattle to tend and crops to plant, neighbors to help, and community celebrations to share. There would be quiet evenings by the fire and busy days when the ranch rang with the sounds of productive work. But tonight, in the peaceful aftermath of love declared and vows exchanged, they simply held each other and listened to the sounds of home settling around them. The whisper of wind through the pines, the gentle movement of horses in the barn, the distant call of night birds welcoming the darkness. The wooden cross that had travelled with Rosalie through her darkest hours now sat on the mantelpiece beside their wedding photograph, no longer a question mark, but an exclamation point of faith restored and hope fulfilled. And in the silver locket that would always rest close to her heart, new photographs joined the old, images of joy and celebration that proved love could triumph over loss, that broken hearts could heal stronger than before. The story that had begun with a woman stumbling through snow with bare feet and empty hands had become the story of a family built on love and strengthened by community, of a future bright with possibility and grounded in the unshakable knowledge that some bonds cannot be broken by time or trial. In the kitchen of the ranch house, surrounded by the evidence of love made manifest in everyday things, Colt and Rosalie Ashford began the first evening of their married life with hearts full of gratitude for the unexpected grace that had brought them together and the certain knowledge that their best days lay ahead.